The first thing the desert gives back is not a palace, not treasure chamber, not a golden idol waiting beneath the sun. It is a corner of stone squared by human hands, jutting from a slope of pale sand, as if the earth has changed its mind and decided to confess. Around it the wind moves softly over the dunes. Nothing else seems alive. The horizon trembles with heat. A few thorn bushes cling to dry ground. Somewhere below, hidden under the weight of centuries, there may be a street. There may be doorways. There may be the broken edge of a market stall, a stairway, a courtyard, a well whose mouth is sealed with dust. What looks empty is not empty at all. It is a city sleeping under sand. This is one of the oldest shocks in archaeology, the discovery that silence can be crowded. A traveller crosses a desert valley and sees only ridges shaped by wind, then a carved facade appears in a cliff. A farmer digs near an oasis and finds bricks older than any village memory. A satellite passes above a dry basin and detects faint lines beneath the surface, the ghost pattern of walls and canals. Again and again in North Africa, Arabia, Central Asia, the Near East, and along old Silk Road corridors, ancient cities emerge from the sand not as fantasy but as evidence. They were not imagined. They were lived in. People baked bread there, sharpened tools, argued over prices buried. Children measured water, welcomed caravans, feared taxes, watched armies, repaired roofs, and believed, as people often do, that the world they knew would continue. Yet the question that follows is rarely simple. Why are they buried? Why did streets once full of life become ridges under dunes? Why do some cities vanish so completely that later generations remember them only as rumours, while others remain half visible, their towers and tombs still staring across the wastes? The easy answer is that the desert swallowed them. It is a powerful image and not entirely wrong. Sand does move, dunes migrate. Wind can strip one place bare and smother another. Canals can vanish under silt. Courtyards can fill grain by grain until only the highest walls remain. But the deeper truth is more unsettling because sand is usually not the first cause. It is often the final witness. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of buried cities is not only a story of ruins, it is a story of how human ambition follows water into dangerous places, how trade makes harsh landscapes bloom, and how fragile those blooms can be when climate politics, soil, and time begin to turn. Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient desert city at its height. The air is dry but not dead. Camels kneel outside a gate, their loads smelling of incense salt leather, dates dyed cloth copper and sweat. Men and women move through narrow streets built to cast shade. Children run between mud brick walls. Potters stack jars near kilns. Scribes mark accounts. Priests tend sanctuaries. Guards watch the road, because a city in the desert is never only a settlement. It is a wager. It bets that water will hold, that caravans will keep coming, that rulers will remain strong enough to protect the route, but not so hungry that they bleed it dry. It bets that wells will not fail, that fields will not salt, that dunes will not close the road, that enemies will not cut the trade arteries that keep it alive. For a time the wager can succeed magnificently. Some desert cities become astonishingly wealthy. Petra, carved into the rose-coloured cliffs of southern Jordan, is not simply a romantic ruin, but the remains of a Nabatean capital that learned how to harvest scarce rain with brilliant skill. Merv in present-day Turkmenistan rose from oasis landscapes into one of the great cities of the Islamic world before conquest and shifting fortunes broke its power. Cities of the Tarim Basin along the desert edges of western China live from the strange marriage of glacier-fed streams and long-distance trade. In Egypt, Sudan, Arabia, Iran, Libya, Morocco, and beyond settlements grew where water routes and authority overlapped. The desert was not always a barrier. Sometimes it was a road. That detail matters because modern eyes often mistake desert ruins for accidents. A buried city seems as though it must have been built in the wrong place, but many of these places were not always as hostile as they appear now, and even when they were dry they were not useless. Desert margins can be rich if water is managed carefully. Oases are not miracles in the supernatural sense. They are points where geology, groundwater, rainfall, and human labour meet. Ancient builders understood slopes, cisterns, channels, flood water, and shade, with a precision that can still surprise engineers today. Some cities survived for centuries not because nature was generous, but because people were patient, observant, and disciplined. Still, the evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for why ancient cities became buried in sand because each city lived inside its own web of causes. Climate could weaken a water system slowly. A river could shift course. An aquifer could drop. Overgrazing could loosen the soil. Farmers could irrigate until salts rose through the earth and poisoned their fields. A trade route could move, leaving warehouses full of silence. An empire could fall, removing protection from roads. A war could empty a city that might otherwise have recovered. Then, when roofs collapsed and canals went uncleaned, wind and sand did the patient work they do best. They covered the evidence, softened the edges, and made abandonment look like disappearance. This is why the phrase buried in sand carries a kind of trap. It makes the desert seem like an attacker rushing in from outside. But many ruined cities were already weakened before the dunes arrived. Sand does not need to defeat a living city that repairs its walls, clears its streets, dredges its channels, and maintains its wells. It waits for maintenance to stop. It waits for doors to fall inward. It waits for the last households to move away from the outer district to the safer inner quarter, then from the inner quarter to a smaller settlement near a better spring, then perhaps away entirely. The burial may look sudden when archaeologists uncover it centuries later, but what survives in the record often suggests a long unravelling. The most haunting ruins are not always the grandest. Sometimes they are modest rooms filled with wind-blown sediment, a cooking hearth sealed under layers of dust, a child's bead found in a collapsed house, a storage jar left where no one returned for it. These details strip away the romance and bring the vanished city close. They remind us that abandonment was not an abstract process. It happened household by household. A family might leave because the well had become brackish. A merchant might leave because caravans no longer stopped there. A farmer might leave because the fields yielded less each year. A craft worker might stay longer hoping things would improve. Officials might insist that taxes still be paid even as the town shrank. Scholars still debate the precise balance of causes in many places, but decline usually becomes visible through small decisions repeated by many people under pressure. And then comes the desert's long memory. Mud brick once exposed melts under rare rains and hardens again under sun. Stone cracks, timber disappears, roofs cave in, sand slips through windows, gathers in corners, climbs walls, covers thresholds. A street becomes a shallow trough, then a line, then nothing. The city is not erased all at once. It is translated into landscape. Walls become ridges, rooms become mounds, towers become strange hills, names fade faster than stones. Later travellers may pass nearby and never know that beneath their feet lies a place where thousands once lived by rules, fears gods, markets, and seasons now almost entirely lost. So the story begins not with one city but with a pattern. Across the old world, humans built at the edge of dryness because the edge was useful. It connected fertile lands to distant markets. It offered minerals, incense trees, salt flats, caravan corridors, and defensible positions. It could make a small kingdom rich if its people controlled movement through emptiness. But that same edge was dangerous. It demanded constant negotiation with water and power. When the balance held, cities rose like lanterns in the dust. When it broke, the light went out and the sand began to remember in its own slow way. To understand the real reason ancient cities were buried, it is necessary to look past the final image of dunes against broken walls. The sand is visible because it arrives last. The deeper causes often begin much earlier in landscapes that were not dead at all but alive with roads, rivers, wells, and human calculation. Before the streets disappeared, they first had to be built. Before the desert became a grave, it had been a doorway. A desert city rarely begins as a monument. It begins as a pause, a place where a traveller can drink, a hollow where winter rain gathers and lingers under gravel, a spring at the foot of limestone cliffs, a bend in a dry valley where floodwater sometimes rushes down with terrifying speed, then vanishes, leaving damp soil and seeds behind, a patch of palms visible from far away, a low mound where people return season after season because animals find shade there, because a trail narrows there, because the stars and ridge lines make it a natural marker on a long and dangerous road. Before stone walls rise, before temples and towers appear, before merchants count profit in storerooms, the future city is simply a useful point in a hard landscape. That is one reason ancient desert cities can feel so mysterious when seen as ruins. Their present surroundings seem to deny their past. Sand stretches outward, heat presses down, water appears absent or hidden. It is tempting to imagine that their builders were reckless, or that some sudden catastrophe transformed a fertile paradise into a wasteland. Sometimes climate did change dramatically, and some deserts truly were greener in earlier periods. The Sahara, for example, passed through humid phases, when lakes, grasslands, animals, and human communities spread across places that are now intensely dry. But many buried cities did not rise in lush worlds that simply vanished overnight. They rose in marginal worlds, in corridors of possibility where human knowledge turned scarcity into survival. The desert in the ancient imagination is often emptiness. In practice, it is full of lines. There are lines of geology where rock layers trap groundwater, lines of seasonal movement where herders guide flocks between pasture and refuge, lines of trade where caravans follow wells like beads on a string, lines of empire where rulers try to hold forts, roads and tax stations along frontiers, lines of pilgrimage, exile, invasion and rumour. A city grows where enough of these lines cross. The place may look isolated on a modern map, but in its own age it can be intensely connected. Consider the oases of Central Asia strung along routes that later become part of the Silk Road. They stand not in defiance of the desert, but because mountains feed them. Snow and glacier melt, descend from high ranges into basins where rivers spread, split, sink, and sometimes die before reaching any sea. Along these waterways, people plant orchards, grow grain, build walls, and create towns that serve caravans moving between China, India, Iran, and the Mediterranean world. Their survival depends on distance as much as water. A settlement must be close enough to the next stop that people and animals can cross the dangerous interval. Too far, and the route fails. Close enough, and the oasis becomes not a remote refuge but a necessary station in a chain of exchange. In Arabia and the Levant, other desert cities grow from different conditions. Some sit near springs, some gather runoff from brief rains, some command passes through mountains or valleys where caravans cannot easily avoid them. Petra is the famous example, dramatic because its architecture seems to emerge from stone itself, but its deeper genius is hydrological. The Nabateans did not simply admire the cliffs, they read them. They understood how sudden rainstorms could become both threat and resource. They cut channels, built dams, shaped cisterns, and guided floodwater into storage. The result was not abundance in the easy sense, it was controlled uncertainty. A city could thrive there because people learned to catch water that arrived violently, irregularly, and without apology. Farther west in North Africa, towns and fortified settlements emerge along routes that connect the Mediterranean world to the Sahara and beyond. Salt gold, slaves, textiles, manuscripts, dates, and grain move across enormous distances, though not always at the same time or under the same powers. Some communities depend on Foggara or Qanat-like underground channel systems that tap groundwater and carry it gently across slopes to fields. These systems are quiet works of engineering easy to overlook because much of their labour lies beneath the surface. They require surveying, maintenance, social cooperation, and authority. A broken tunnel is not merely a technical problem. It is a political and communal test. This is where the romance of lost cities meets a less glamorous truth. Most ancient urban life depends on maintenance, not heroic construction once in the distant past, but repetitive work. Clearing channels, repairing cistern plaster, desilting basins, rebuilding terrace walls, managing grazing, watching wells, settling disputes over who receives water first and who waits. A desert city is not kept alive by a single brilliant invention. It is kept alive by routines, and routines are vulnerable to exhaustion, conflict, corruption, invasion, neglect, and bad years that arrive too close together. What survives in the record suggests that some cities understood this fragility very well. Their architecture is not only beautiful, it is defensive against dryness. Narrow streets create shade and reduce heat. Thick walls moderate temperature. Courtyards protect domestic space from wind. Storage rooms hold grain against uncertainty. Fortifications guard not only people, but also water points, because in arid country, a well can be more valuable than a tower. In some regions, even burial customs and sacred places cluster around water sources, as if the landscape itself teaches that life, memory, and survival must gather near the same hidden pulse. Yet no desert city lives by water alone. Water permits settlement, but movement gives it wealth. A spring with no root may sustain a village. A spring on a trade road can sustain a city. This is why ancient deserts are not simply margins of civilization. They are sometimes the spaces between civilizations that make exchange possible. The emptiness becomes valuable because it must be crossed. Whoever can provide safety storage animals, guides, and water can turn danger into revenue. The harsher the crossing, the more precious the stopping place becomes. This helps explain why some ancient cities appear almost improbable. They are not located where modern people might choose to build a capital. They are located where ancient networks made them powerful. A caravan city can grow rich because it controls bottlenecks rather than farmland. A desert fortress can matter because it watches a frontier road. An oasis town can become cosmopolitan because everyone passing through must pause there. Merchants, monks, soldiers, envoys, smugglers, refugees, and storytellers. Languages mix. Religions travel, diseases travel too. So do coins, artistic styles, crops, technologies, and ideas. The city becomes a filter through which the wider world passes. This surprising detail is that many such places were never meant to be isolated jewels in an ocean of sand. They were nodes in systems. Their streets made sense because of roads beyond them. Their markets made sense because of demand far away. Their wells mattered because of distances measured in days of thirst. Remove the system and the city's logic begins to weaken. a route shifts north, a port rises elsewhere, an empire secures a safer road, a river crossing becomes dangerous, a tax regime changes, a war closes a corridor. Suddenly what has been central becomes peripheral. The same walls remain the same. Wells may still hold water, but fewer strangers arrive, fewer goods pass through. Fewer hands are available to maintain the delicate arrangements that made urban life possible. Scholars still debate how much climate trade and politics mattered in particular cases because the evidence rarely speaks with one voice. A layer of wind-blown sand may show abandonment, but not why people left. A broken canal may show neglect, but not what caused the neglect. A decline in imported pottery may suggest weaker trade, but it may also reflect changing taste or local production. Ancient cities do not leave behind simple explanations. They leave patterns, and the patterns must be read carefully. Still, a broad truth emerges. The desert did not always destroy these cities by being hostile. Sometimes it helped create them by being difficult. Its difficulty concentrated movement. It made water points powerful. It rewarded those who mastered storage, guidance, and exchange. It turned certain settlements into doorways between worlds. But a doorway is useful only while people continue to pass through it. When the flow thins, when water falters, when maintenance fails, the desert does not need to change its nature. It simply resumes its older rhythm, and so the buried city begins to look different. Not as a foolish mistake in an empty wasteland, but as the remains of a successful negotiation that eventually failed. For generations, perhaps centuries, people learned how to live where life required skill. They made harsh ground productive. They made distance profitable. They turned pauses into towns, towns into cities and cities, into names known far beyond the horizon. Then the balance shifted slowly or violently, and the same forces that once made the place important began to loosen their grip. The road no longer guaranteed arrival. The spring no longer guaranteed security. The oasis no longer guaranteed a future. Before sand covered the streets, life had gathered there because the desert was not merely an ending. It was a passage. Water is the quiet architect behind almost every city the desert ever allows. Stone may survive more visibly carved facades, may impress later travellers. Walls may cast long shadows across abandoned ground, but water decides where life can gather and how long it can remain. In dry country, a city is never only built upward from foundations. It is built downward into wells, sideways, through channels, inward into cisterns, outward across fields, and patiently through rules that decide who may drink, who may irrigate, and who must wait. The most important structures may be the least dramatic: a plastered tank under a courtyard, a buried conduit following a gentle slope, a small dam across a wadi, a line of stones placed to slow a flash flood before it tears through the settlement. The gift is fragile because desert water often arrives in forms that are difficult to trust. It may come as a spring fed by an aquifer no one can see. It may come from winter storms that vanish for months, then return all at once with enough force to drown animals and break walls. It may come from mountain snow far away, reaching an oasis as a river whose source belongs to another climate entirely. It may come as groundwater, collected over centuries, a hidden inheritance that can be spent faster than it is renewed. Ancient communities did not always understand these systems in modern scientific terms, but they understood their moods. They watched the level of wells. They knew which floods were useful and which were dangerous. They learned that a channel neglected for one season could become a wound in the city's future. Petra shows this clearly, though it is only one example among many. The city's fame rests on rock-cut tombs and glowing sandstone, yet its survival depends on the management of water in a place where rainfall is limited and uneven. The Nabateans shaped the landscape to catch runoff from surrounding hills, guide it through channels, store it in cisterns, and protect the inhabited areas from destructive floods. This was not simply clever engineering for comfort. It was the condition of urban life. The same storm that might refill reservoirs could also kill if uncontrolled. The city exists within a bargain except the violence of rare water, then tame enough of it to last through dryness. In other regions, the system is quieter but no less remarkable. Qanats Foggaras and similar underground channels carry water from uplands or aquifers to fields and settlements using a slight gradient. From above, they may appear only as rows of small shafts in the earth, like a dotted line across emptiness. Beneath the surface, however, they represent astonishing labour. Workers dig through soil and rock, maintain airflow, remove sediment, and keep the passage from collapsing. The advantage is subtle underground channels reduce evaporation, a crucial benefit in hot, dry climates. But they also create dependence. A city fed by such a system must maintain not only the visible settlement, but also the hidden veins that sustain it. The evidence remains incomplete for many ancient water networks, because water infrastructure is easily reused, repaired, buried, or destroyed. A canal can be cleared by one generation and mistaken by another for a natural depression. A cistern can be filled with debris, reopened, then abandoned again. A well may continue serving nomads long after the city around it collapses. Archaeologists must read traces that are often fragmentary mineral deposits on plaster sediment, in basins, pollen from irrigated fields, water lift devices, inscriptions about land rights, or the layout of streets that seems to bend around vanished channels. What survives in the record suggests not only technical skill but social organization. Water must be engineered, but it must also be governed. This is where the fragility deepens. A reservoir can be built of stone. A water-sharing agreement exists only as long as people accept it, enforce it, and believe the system is worth preserving. In times of prosperity, disputes can be managed. In lean years, every measure becomes sharper. If the flood is weak, which field receives water? If a canal breaks, who repairs it? If a ruler demands grain or taxes even after drought, who bears the loss? If newcomers arrive, do they receive access? If wealthier households control wells, does the poorer edge of the city begin to empty first? No single explanation fully accounts for urban decline, but in desert cities the politics of water often sit close to the heart of the matter. There is a lesser-known danger in irrigation itself. Water can make fields bloom and then slowly poison them. In arid regions, evaporation draws salts upward through the soil. If drainage is poor, salt accumulates near the surface, reducing yields and eventually making land difficult or impossible to cultivate. This process is not always dramatic. A field does not become barren in a single day. It weakens. Crops fail unevenly. Farmers compensate by using more land or more water, sometimes worsening the problem. In some ancient landscapes, salinization appears to have contributed to agricultural stress, though scholars still debate its scale and importance in each case. The lesson is unsettling. The tool that sustains a city can also become one of the pressures that undermines it. Wells carry their own uncertainties. A shallow well can fail after a series of dry years. A deeper aquifer may seem dependable until extraction increases. If more people settle, more animals arrive, more fields are planted, and more caravans stop, demand rises. Success becomes a strain. A small oasis that supports a village may not support a city forever. Ancient people were not blind to limits, but prosperity has a way of making limits look negotiable. Storage can smooth a bad season. Trade can import grain. Authority can organize labor. Ritual can reassure the anxious. Yet if the underlying water balance shifts, every solution becomes more expensive. The most dangerous failures are often cascading. A drought reduces crop yields. Lower yields weaken tax revenue and household reserves. Maintenance crews shrink because labour is needed elsewhere, or because the state can no longer pay them. A neglected canal carries less water. Less water produces poorer harvests. Poorer harvests lead to migration, conflict, debt, or unrest. As people leave, fewer remain to maintain the infrastructure. Windblown sand begins to settle in channels that once ran clear. The city does not fall because one cistern cracks. It declines because the web around the cistern begins to fray. There is also the problem of memory. Water systems require knowledge passed across generations, where the old channel runs, which shaft is dangerous, how deep silt lies after a storm, how to read cloud over distant hills, when to open and close a gate, how to repair plaster so it holds. If a city is disrupted by war, plague, migration, or political collapse, this knowledge can thin. A later population may live among the remains of a sophisticated system without fully using it. They may reuse stones from a dam for house walls, not because they are foolish, but because the larger organization needed to maintain the dam has disappeared. Once a water system becomes ruin, restoring it may demand more labor than a diminished community can provide. And yet these systems also reveal extraordinary resilience. Some desert settlements survived repeated crises because their water networks were diverse. They did not rely on one source alone. They combined wells, cisterns, floodwater capture, imported supplies, seasonal grazing, and trade. They adjusted settlement patterns. They shifted fields. They stored grain. They built social habits around scarcity. In the ruins, survival can be harder to see than collapse because survival leaves repairs, modifications, and layers that look messy compared with the clean drama of abandonment. But for many centuries, people did not fail. They endured. That endurance is essential to the story. Ancient cities buried in sand were not doomed from the moment of foundation. They were living experiments in managing uncertainty. Their builders understood dryness not as a blank wall, but as a condition to be worked with. They made water visible where it was hidden, stored it where it was brief, slowed it where it was violent, and rationed it where it was scarce. Their achievement was not that they defeated the desert. It was that they negotiated with it long enough for streets, markets, temples, gardens, and households to grow. But negotiation is not possession. Water can be guided, stored, taxed, prayed over, measured, and fought for, but it cannot be commanded forever. When the balance shifts, the city's most brilliant systems become signs of vulnerability. The channels that once brought life become lines waiting to be blocked. The cisterns that once promised security become hollow rooms filling with dust. The wells that once drew people together become memories at the center of abandoned courtyards. The desert does not need to erase the evidence. It only needs to wait until the hands that kept water moving are gone. Trade gives desert cities their second heartbeat. Water keeps people alive, but movement gives them scale wealth and a reason to build beyond the needs of a small village. A spring can gather shepherds, farmers, and a few families of craftsmen. A spring on a major road can gather warehouses, guards, moneylenders, translators, shrines, stables, tax collectors, inns, and officials who understand that every loaded animal arriving at the gate carries not only goods but power. In such places, the desert is not empty space between civilizations. It is the long, dangerous room through which civilizations must pass to reach one another. The road is often invisible now. Wind has crossed it for centuries. Stones have shifted. Wells have silted. Modern borders cut across old pathways with the confidence of rulers who forget that geography is older than maps. Yet ancient travelers knew these routes with precision. They knew where the next water lay, where dunes made passage difficult, where raiders might wait, where a mountain pass opened, where salt flats dazzled the eyes, where a dead camel on the horizon might warn of a failed crossing. Travel through arid lands was not romantic, it was calculation. Distance was measured in endurance fodder skins of water and trust in guides whose knowledge could mean survival. The goods that moved through these corridors could transform cities far from their sources. Incense from southern Arabia passed toward temples and wealthy households across the Mediterranean and Near East, valued not merely for fragrance, but for ritual status and medicine. Salt moved from desert flats and mines because bodies, animals, and food preservation required it. Copper, tin, gold, ivory, lapis lazuli, silk spices, dates, grain, wool, glassware, manuscripts, and slaves all crossed dry zones at different times and places. No single caravan carried the whole ancient world on its back, but the combined movement of many journeys made certain cities rich because they controlled the pause. That pause was valuable. A caravan approaching a city needed more than water. It needed animals rested or exchanged loads, checked repairs, made news, gathered protection, negotiated taxes paid, and sometimes legal disputes settled before the next leg began. Merchants needed storage, credit, and contacts. Pilgrims needed food and reassurance. Envoys needed safe reception. Soldiers needed supplies. A desert city could become a machine for turning transit into profit. Its rulers did not need to produce every luxury themselves. They needed to control the place where luxuries slowed down. Petra again offers a striking example, though its fame can obscure the wider pattern. The Nabateans grew powerful in part because they sat across routes linking Arabia, the Levant, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world. Their skill with water allowed settlement. Their position in trade allowed prosperity. The carved facades that later visitors admire are not random ornaments in an empty canyon. They are the monumental expression of wealth drawn from movement, taxation, diplomacy, and adaptation. The city's stone face is what remains visible, but the roads that fed it are the vanished bloodstream. Far to the east, oasis settlements along the Silk Road show the same logic in another form. Around the Taklamakan, desert towns survived where rivers descending from mountains spread into habitable margins. These settlements could be agriculturally productive, but their larger importance came from their role as staging points between empires and cultures. Buddhism moved along these roads, carried by monks, merchants, texts, and images. Artistic styles changed as they crossed languages and kingdoms. Even the dead sometimes reveal the scale of contact with textiles. Papers, coins, and objects pointing to networks wider than any one oasis. The desert did not isolate these cities. It made their connections more deliberate. Yet trade is a dangerous foundation because it depends on forces beyond the city's walls. A well can be deepened, a canal can be repaired, a road can be guarded. But demand in a distant empire, peace between rival powers, the safety of a mountain past the rise of a port, or the preference of merchants for another route may lie outside local control. A city may maintain its reservoirs and still decline if caravans stop coming. Its fields may still grow grain, but the luxury markets shrink. The tax offices empty, the inns quiet, and the craftsmen who once served foreign customers leave for better opportunities. Scholars still debate the timing and importance of such shifts in many places. Trade rarely disappears in a single clean line. Routes bend rather than die. Merchants adapt. A dangerous road may revive when conditions improve. A city may lose one trade and gain another. Archaeologists must be cautious when reading decline from fewer imported goods, because local production changing fashion or political restrictions can alter the material record. Still, broad patterns are clear enough. When long-distance movement weakens, cities built around movement become vulnerable in ways farming towns may not. A lesser-known detail is that trade roads also carry maintenance indirectly. Wealth from exchange pays for guards, workers' wells, animal fodder reservoirs and public buildings. When that wealth decreases, the physical systems of the city may suffer. A dry channel may not mean climate alone has failed. It may mean the city no longer has enough revenue or authority to keep the channel clear. A ruined caravanserai may not mean travellers never came. It may mean too few came to justify repair. Economic decline can appear in the ground as environmental neglect, making cause and effect difficult to separate. Trade also brings political attention, and attention can be both blessing and burden. A wealthy desert city attracts rulers who want revenue and armies that want supply. Empires protect roads because they profit from them, but they also tax them. Forts rise. Customs stations appear. Local elites negotiate autonomy, tribute, or alliance. When the imperial system is strong, merchants may benefit from security. When it weakens, the same roads become exposed. Raiders rival states' unpaid soldiers, and local conflicts can turn profitable corridors into risks. A caravan does not need perfect safety, but it needs predictable danger. Once uncertainty rises beyond a certain point, merchants choose another path. In some cases, conquest changes a city's fate abruptly. In others, the effect is slower. A new ruler favours a different route. A port on the coast becomes more efficient. Maritime trade reduces the importance of overland caravans for certain goods. A frontier shifts. A religious pilgrimage road gains or loses significance. The old city still stands, but the world that made it necessary has moved. This may be one of the most painful forms of decline because nothing in the local landscape has to look catastrophic at first. The wells still hold water. The streets still cast shade. The warehouses still have doors. But fewer animals kneel outside them. The human consequences would have unfolded quietly. A trader who once visited every season arrives every third year, then not at all. A family that rented rooms to travellers finds its courtyard empty. A scribe copies fewer contracts. A potter sells more to locals and less to strangers. Guards go unpaid. A gate tower is patched roughly instead of rebuilt. Young people leave for cities where money still moves. The remaining inhabitants may not think they are witnessing history. They may simply feel that business is poor, taxes are unfair, water repairs are harder to organise, and the old days seem larger in memory than in fact. What survives in the record often captures this transition imperfectly. Imported ceramics decline. Coin circulation changes. Luxury architecture stops expanding. Repairs become cheaper. Public spaces are reused for humbler purposes. Large houses are subdivided. Storage patterns shift. Burials appear in places once reserved for other uses. None of these signs alone tells the full story, but together they suggest that a city can shrink without vanishing. It can live on at a lower intensity, still inhabited, still meaningful, but no longer able to defend itself against the pressures that larger wealth once held back. This matters because sand burial often follows economic fading. A busy road is constantly disturbed. Feet hooves, wheels, sweepers builders, and repair crews interrupt the work of wind. An abandoned road invites accumulation. Sand gathers where walls break the wind. Empty courtyards become traps for dust. Roofless rooms fill. The city that loses movement begins to lose its battle against stillness. The desert does not rush in like an invading army. It enters through neglect, one corner at a time, and yet for centuries these roads made astonishing worlds possible. They carried not only profit but imagination. A person standing in a desert city market might hear languages from distant valleys, see textiles woven beyond mountains, smell resins from trees never seen handle coins, stamped with foreign rulers, and learn news of wars, births, famines, and miracles weeks or months after they happened. The city was a listening post of the ancient world. Its people lived by interpreting arrivals. A cloud of dust on the horizon could mean wealth, danger, kin taxes, or strangers with stories. So the buried cities of the desert are also buried maps of connection. Their ruins remind us that remoteness is not always isolation. A place that looks lonely now may once have been crowded with movement. Its walls may have risen because the empty land around it forced everyone to pass through a narrow chain of survival. But when the chain broke, when merchants turned away, when empires shifted, when pilgrims chose another road, the same geography that had made the city valuable made it vulnerable. Without traffic, a doorway is only an opening in a wall. Without movement, the road becomes memory, and memory in the desert is easily covered. Drying is rarely dramatic at first. It does not always arrive as a single year of hunger, a sky without mercy, or a riverbed cracking open before the eyes of a terrified city. More often it begins almost politely. A flood comes a little lower than expected. A spring recovers more slowly after summer. Pasture returns later. The palms bear less fruit. A farmer notices that the old planting rhythm no longer feels reliable. A herder pushes animals farther from the settlement. A well that once seemed generous now requires a longer rope. Nothing has ended, not yet. Life continues, accounts are kept. Children are born, markets open, and officials assure themselves that difficult years have happened before. But beneath that ordinary surface, the margin of safety narrows. Ancient cities at desert edges often depend on climate patterns larger than their inhabitants can see. A town may rely on rainfall falling far away in mountains. An oasis may depend on groundwater accumulated during wetter periods, long before the present population arrived. A river may be shaped by snowmelt, monsoon strength, seasonal storms, or subtle shifts in vegetation across a wider basin. When these patterns change, the effect may reach the city slowly disguised as bad luck. One dry year can be endured. 2 can be survived with storage, trade, migration, and prayer. A generation of irregular water is different. It changes decisions. It changes debts. It changes trust. Across the long history of deserts, climate has never been fixed. The Sahara is the clearest reminder. There were periods after the last ice age when parts of what is now hyper-arid desert supported lakes, wetlands, grasslands, animals and human communities. Rock art across North Africa preserves images of cattle, wild fauna, and human activity in places that today seem almost impossible for such scenes. But the end of the African humid period was not one simple curtain falling everywhere at once. Drying unfolded unevenly across regions and centuries influenced by shifts in Earth's orbit, monsoon systems, vegetation feedbacks and local geography. Scholars still debate the exact pace and regional differences, but the broad transformation is clear. Landscapes that had supported more water-dependent life became increasingly arid. This matters because later desert cities often rose within the aftermath of such changes, or along remaining corridors of water in a drier world. They were not always built during lush conditions, but many depended on inherited hydrological advantages, fossil groundwater, seasonal runoff, shrinking rivers or oases sustained by older climatic regimes. In such places, the past can subsidize the present. A well may draw from water laid down under conditions that no longer exist. A community may believe it is living from a renewable source, when in modern terms it is partly spending an ancient reserve. The evidence remains incomplete for many sites, but the principle is important. A city can be vulnerable, not because its builders misunderstood everything, but because the climate system supporting it operates on scales too large for local experience. In Central Asia, the relationship between water and climate is equally intricate. Oasis settlements around desert basins often depend on rivers fed by mountains. If glaciers retreat, snow patterns shift, channels migrate, or irrigation networks expand beyond sustainable limits. Water reaching downstream fields can decline, but the causes are rarely easy to separate. Climate change may reduce flow. Human diversion may intensify scarcity. Political instability may prevent maintenance. Sediment may alter channels. A river can abandon one course and favour another, leaving a settlement suddenly less fortunate than a neighbour. To later observers, the ruined town appears swallowed by desert, but its decline may have begun upstream in snowfields, riverbeds, and decisions made far beyond its walls. The drying of a landscape can also change the behaviour of sand. Vegetation anchors soil. Shrubs, grasses, reeds, and cultivated fields interrupt wind. When rainfall decreases or grazing pressure increases, plant cover thins. Bare ground expands. Dust moves more easily. Dunes become more active. A city that once stood near stable sandy ground may find itself facing mobile dunes generations later. This does not mean the desert suddenly attacks. It means the protective skin of the landscape weakens. Once that happens, wind has more material to lift, push, and pile. What had been background becomes an agent. There is a surprising intimacy between climate and architecture here. A wall can create shelter, but it can also create a trap for blown sediment. A street aligned with prevailing winds may be scoured clean in one period and filled in another if surrounding surfaces change. A canal that once carried seasonal water may become a trench where sand gathers. Abandoned fields can turn into dust sources. Drying then does not merely reduce water, it alters the city's physical conversation with air, soil, plants, and human labour. The same layout that worked under one environmental balance becomes harder to sustain under another. Still, it would be misleading to blame climate alone. Ancient people were not passive victims of weather. Many communities adapted with remarkable flexibility. They shifted crops, moved herds, built new storage, deepened wells, repaired dams, changed trade relationships, and sometimes reduced the size of settlements rather than abandon them entirely. Some cities endured long dry phases because their water systems and social institutions were resilient. Others failed during conditions that neighbouring communities survived. No single explanation fully accounts for this difference. Climate is pressure, not destiny. It creates stress, but whether stress becomes collapse depends on politics, wealth, technology, conflict, population, choices made under uncertainty. That uncertainty can be seen in the archaeology of decline. A dry period does not always leave a neat label in the ground. Instead, it may appear as changing plant remains fewer water-loving species in pollen. Records altered animal bones, suggesting shifts in herding, increased dust in lake sediments, abandoned irrigation features, or settlement movement toward more reliable water. Even these clues require caution. A change in crops might reflect markets rather than rainfall. A decline in population at one site might mean migration to another, not regional disaster. Archaeologists and paleoclimatologists must braid different kinds of evidence together, and the braid is often frayed. Yet the long work of drying is visible in the broad arc of many desert margins. Cities that once stood near productive edges become stranded deeper inside aridity. Roads that once crossed manageable dry zones become riskier. Wells that once linked journeys become too uncertain. Pasture that once supported caravan animals shrinks. The cost of movement rises. The cost of farming rises. The cost of maintenance rises. A society can absorb some increase, but not endless increase. Eventually, the same city that once thrived because it mastered scarcity may find that scarcity has changed shape faster than its institutions can respond. The human experience of this change is easy to underestimate because climate history often sounds abstract. Monsoons weaken, rivers shift, aridity expands. But for the people inside a city, these phrases become daily pressure. A mother walks farther for water. A farmer plants less land because the canal is unreliable. A merchant hesitates before sending goods across a route where animals may not find enough fodder. A ruler demands labour to repair a reservoir, but households already need every hand for survival. Priests or local elders may interpret hardship through moral ritual or political language. Blame moves through the community. Some say the old rules have been neglected. Some say the governor is corrupt. Some say the wells have always recovered before. Some quietly prepare to leave. This is one of the cruel features of slow environmental change. It often becomes undeniable only after many decisions have already been shaped by it. A city does not need to recognize climate change as a grand pattern to be transformed by it. People respond to immediate pressures: a failed harvest, a weaker spring, a dangerous road, a tax they cannot pay a neighbor who has moved away. Over time, those immediate responses become historical movement. Neighborhoods thin, outer fields are abandoned, herding routes change, repairs are postponed. The city's ability to resist sand declines not because everyone gives up at once, but because fewer people have the surplus energy to keep fighting the landscape. And then the visible desert advances, though that word can mislead. It is not always a marching frontier, it is a loosening. Plants loosen their grip on the soil, water loosens its promise, trade loosens its rhythm, authority loosens its control, families loosen their attachment to houses that no longer guarantee a future. Sand fills the spaces opened by those loosenings. Later, when only ruins remain, the dunes seem like the cause because they are what the eye can still see. But the deeper movement may have begun in clouds that failed to gather in snow, that melted differently in river branches, that wandered in grasses that did not return, after grazing in wells lowered one handspan at a time. The real tragedy is not that deserts change, they always have. The tragedy is that cities are built on expectations. A wall expects repair, a canal expects flow, a market expects arrival, a field expects seasons that vary, but do not betray the entire system. When those expectations no longer hold, the city enters a long negotiation with loss. Some places adapt and survive in altered form. Some shrink into villages. Some become seasonal camps. Some are abandoned so completely that their names fade, leaving only mounds under sand and the difficult work of asking what happened. Drying then is not a single villain. It is a background force that makes every other weakness sharper. It turns political mistakes into disasters, trade disruptions into crises, poor land use into lasting damage, and ordinary drought into memory. It is the slow tightening of a world that once seemed difficult but manageable. And when the tightening continues long enough, the desert does not need to bury a city in one dramatic night. It only has to wait while the city's reasons for existing dry away. A city can be wounded by the very habits that once allowed it to prosper. This is one of the uncomfortable truths hidden beneath ancient sand. The desert is not always an outside force pressing against a perfectly balanced human world. Sometimes people help prepare the ground for their own difficulty, not because they're foolish or careless, but because survival itself demands pressure on land, trees, animals, and soil. A city needs food. It needs fuel. It needs timber, reeds, plaster bricks, fodder, leather transport animals, fields, gardens, and grazing. Each need seems reasonable by itself. Together over generations they can change the landscape around the city until the margin of safety grows dangerously thin. At first cultivation looks like victory. A dry plain becomes patterned with fields. Water moves through channels. Barley, wheat, dates, grapes, figs, cotton, millet, or garden crops grow, where uncultivated land once held scrub and gravel. The city becomes more secure because it can feed more people, store more grain, support craftsmen, host caravans, and pay soldiers or officials. But irrigation in arid land is never neutral. Water carries minerals. Sun pulls moisture upward. If drainage is poor, salts begin to gather in the soil. The change may be almost invisible at first, a faint whitening on the surface, a weaker crop, a field that needs more water to produce less. Over time, the earth that once answered labour begins to resist it. Salinization is not the explanation for every abandoned desert city, and scholars still debate its importance from region to region, but it is one of the great quiet dangers of ancient irrigation. In hot, dry climates, evaporation can turn a productive field into a slowly hardening problem. Farmers may respond by flushing soils with more water-changing crops, leaving land fallow, or opening new fields elsewhere. These strategies can work if water and land are sufficient. But if population is high, taxation is heavy, or climate is drying, there may be little room to rest the soil. The city's appetite keeps demanding harvests, and the land pays the price. Grazing creates another kind of pressure. Goat, sheep, camels, cattle, and donkeys are not just animals. They are transport wealth, milk, meat, wool, hides, manure, and status. A desert trade city may require enormous numbers of animals moving in and out, feeding near wells, browsing shrubs, trampling fragile ground, and stripping vegetation from already vulnerable slopes. Managed carefully, pastoralism can be sustainable and highly adaptive. Managed under stress or intensified around shrinking water points, it can expose soil to wind. The plants that anchor dust disappear first in patches, then in wider scars. Once the surface is loose, the wind begins to do work that human hands cannot easily undo. Fuel may be even less visible in the ruins, but it matters deeply. Ancient cities burned wood, charcoal, dung reeds, and brush for cooking, heating pottery, metalworking, lime production, brick firing, and daily life. Around a growing settlement nearby, vegetation could be cut faster than it regenerated. People then travelled farther for fuel, used inferior materials or shifted practices. In some places, deforestation and brush clearance may have contributed to erosion, reduced shade, and changed local hydrology. The evidence remains incomplete because wood turns to ash and absence is difficult to excavate. Still, charcoal analysis, pollen, ancient texts, and landscape studies sometimes reveal a slow thinning of the living cover around cities. Mud brick itself ties urban growth to land use. Bricks require soil, water, straw, or chaff labour and sun. A city built of mud brick is wonderfully suited to arid regions because the material is local and insulating, but it must be maintained. Walls erode, roofs need repair, and abandoned mud brick returns to earth quickly. When a city is thriving, this cycle is part of life. When decline begins, the same material becomes fragile. Roofs collapse, walls slump. Dust from the city's own body mixes with wind-blown sediment. In time, the city helps bury itself, not metaphorically, but physically, as its buildings crumble into the layers that cover later floors. The surprising detail is that environmental damage often does not look like damage to the people causing it. Cutting shrubs for fuel may be ordinary necessity. Expanding fields may be responsible planning. Increasing herds may be a sensible response to trade demand. Digging another canal may seem like innovation. No one has to intend destruction. The danger lies in scale and repetition. A practice that is harmless for a small settlement can become dangerous for a city. A strategy that works during wet decades may fail during dry ones. A landscape that can recover from occasional pressure may not recover when pressure becomes constant. This is why the boundary between natural and human causes becomes blurred. If rainfall declines and overgrazing increases at the same time, which one causes dunes to move? If irrigation expands during a period of political ambition, then salinity rises during later drought is the problem, environmental, economic, or administrative. If a city cuts timber from uplands, erosion increases, canals silt up, and water delivery worsens. Where does the chain begin? No single explanation fully accounts for these transformations. Human action and natural systems are braided together, and the braid tightens around the city slowly. Ancient officials sometimes recognized pieces of the problem. Rules about water grazing, tree cutting, canal, labor field boundaries, and taxes appear in many societies because people understood that land use must be governed. But rules are only as strong as the institutions behind them. In times of prosperity, elites may ignore limits because expansion brings wealth. In times of hardship, desperate households may ignore limits because survival comes before long-term caution. Empires may demand grain from regions already under strain. Local leaders may overpromise production to retain favor. The field, the herd, and the tax ledger become connected in ways that do not show up in the romantic image of a lost city under dunes. The consequences can be seen in the ground. Fields are abandoned at the margins first. Canals silt and are recut, sometimes following shorter or more desperate routes. Animal bones may show changing herd composition. Plant remains may indicate a shift toward more drought-tolerant crops or weeds that thrive in disturbed soil. Windblown deposits thicken. Houses are repaired with reused materials. Storage rooms become smaller. Public buildings lose their finish. These are not always signs of collapse, but they can mark adaptation under pressure. What survives in the record suggests that people often fought decline creatively before they left. And leaving did not always mean failure. Sometimes migration was intelligence. If fields no longer fed a family moving toward a better water source, was not abandonment of civilization, but preservation of life. A city may shrink because its people are making rational choices. They may relocate to a nearby settlement, shift to pastoral life, join relatives elsewhere, or follow a trade route that still functions. Archaeology often sees the empty house, not the successful escape. The buried room can look tragic because it is silent, but the people who once lived there may have survived by refusing to remain attached to walls that could no longer protect them. Still, for the city itself, each departure mattered. Fewer farmers meant fewer canal workers. Fewer herders meant less manure for fields or fewer animals for transport. Fewer craftsmen meant less repair. Fewer taxpayers meant weaker authority. The land around the settlement, already stressed, received less care. Terraces broke, channels filled, palms died, boundaries blurred. Wind found loose soil and carried it inward. A city does not need all its inhabitants to leave before sand begins to take hold. It only needs enough gaps in the human routine. There's a dry irony in this. The most successful desert cities were often those that learned to intensify their landscapes. They extracted more food, more water, more fuel, more movement, more wealth from places that looked poor to outsiders. That intensification made beauty, complexity, and culture possible. It supported temples, tombs, markets, archives, gardens, and roads. But it also made those cities dependent on constant balance. Push the fields too hard, graze the slopes too heavily cut, too much vegetation demand too much water, and the system that once seemed ingenious begins to lose resilience. The ancient inhabitants would not have described this in modern environmental language. They might have spoken of bad years, weak floods, failing wells, greedy officials, divine displeasure, dangerous roads, or poor harvests. Their explanations belong to their worlds, and they were not necessarily wrong from their point of view. but from a longer distance the pattern becomes clearer. Cities buried in sand are often not simply victims of the desert. They are remains of human landscape relationships that became too strained to continue in their old form. When the fields turn to dust, it is not only because rain has failed. It is because soil has been asked to do too much, water has been asked to stretch too far, plants have been removed from places that needed their roots, and institutions have been asked to manage scarcity under pressure. The desert receives the result. Sand moves over abandoned furrows, dust gathers in empty irrigation cuts. The walls of houses made from the same earth that once fed the city soften and fall. Slowly the place becomes part of the landscape again. What had been cultivated ground becomes open surface. What had been a street becomes a shallow line. What had been a city becomes a mound, and the mound waits for someone centuries later to ask why the sand is there. Sand moves with a patience that can make it seem almost harmless. A few grains slide across a threshold. A thin skin of dust gathers in the corner of a courtyard. A drift forms against the outside of a wall after a windy season, then is cleared by someone with a basket, a shovel, or simply a tired hand. In a living city, sand is work. It is swept away, trampled, flat, dug from drains, lifted from doorways thrown beyond the street, and forgotten until it returns. As long as enough people remain, the city interrupts the desert's habits. But once the rhythm of maintenance weakens, sand stops being a nuisance and becomes an architect of burial. The popular image is often too violent. A city stands under a blue sky. A storm rises. Dunes crash over the walls like waves. By morning, only the tallest towers remain. Such things may happen in stories, and severe sandstorms can be dangerous, blinding and destructive, but most urban burial is slower and stranger. Dunes migrate over years, decades, or centuries depending on wind sediment supply, moisture, vegetation, and terrain. Sand does not need speed. It needs repetition. It advances by small movements, saltation, where grains hop close to the ground, creep where larger grains roll or slide, suspension where finer dust rises and travels far. The result can look like a slow tide, but it is built from countless tiny impacts. A dune is not a random heap. It has shape, direction, and behavior. Wind pushes grains up a gentle slope until they cross the crest and tumble down the steeper slip face. In this way, the dune moves while remaining itself like a body walking grain by grain. If winds blow mainly from one direction, crescent-shaped dunes may migrate across open ground. If winds vary, more complex forms appear. Around ruins, the pattern changes again. Walls block wind and create zones of turbulence. Courtyards trap sediment. Doorways funnel drafts. Broken roofs allow sand to enter rooms, while fallen beams and stones keep it from leaving easily. A city is full of traps. This is a lesser-known reason ruins can be buried so effectively. Buildings do not merely disappear under a flat blanket. They help catch the material that covers them. An abandoned house with standing walls becomes a basin. The first sand inside it protects the floor from erosion. More sand follows. The walls collapse inward, adding rubble. Dust settles between stones. Rain, if it comes, hardens layers. Animals burrow. Plants root briefly and die. A room becomes a deposit, a sealed volume of time. To an archaeologist, this can be fortunate. Burial preserves floors, hearths, tools, bones, seeds, and sometimes footprints. To the city, it is erasure by preservation. Sand can also choke the systems that once kept a city alive. Canals are especially vulnerable. An open channel in windy country is a ready-made line for drifting sediment. If water flows regularly, it can carry some silt away, though too much sediment creates its own problems. If flow becomes irregular, sand gathers. A partially blocked canal delivers less water. Less water means weaker fields. Weaker fields mean fewer people and less labour for cleaning. The channel fills further. This feedback is quiet but deadly. The desert does not need to cover the houses first. It can begin by interrupting the veins. Roads suffer in a similar way. A used road is compacted and visible. Feet, hooves, wheels, and dragging loads keep the surface open. Landmarks are maintained. Wells are cleared. Way stations are repaired. Once movement declines, small dunes cross the track. Travellers detour. The detour becomes the new path if enough people use it. The old road fades. Sand covers markers. A city dependent on that road becomes harder to reach, which causes fewer people to come, which makes the road still weaker. Geography can forget a city before history does. The movement of sand is not only a desert process. It depends on supply. Loose sediment may come from dry riverbeds, lake margins, abandoned fields, eroding mud brick exposed floodplains, or deflated soils where vegetation has vanished. This means that a buried city may be covered partly by material created or released through its own decline. Fields once protected by crops become sources of dust. Irrigation channels once wet enough to resist wind become dry corridors. Mud brick walls crumble into fine particles. The boundary between the natural dune and the human ruin becomes blurred. The city falls apart and the wind rearranges it. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases because sand layers can be difficult to interpret. A thick deposit may indicate gradual accumulation, a storm event or repeated episodes separated by cleaning and reoccupation. A room filled with sand may have been abandoned, temporarily unused, or deliberately backfilled. Windblown sediment can resemble other deposits unless studied carefully. Archaeologists look at grain size layering artifacts within the deposits, erosion surfaces, plant remains, and relationships to walls and floors. Even then, uncertainty remains. What looks like a single burial may hide several cycles of abandonment and return. This matters because many ancient cities did not simply die once. They changed hands, shrank, revived, shifted location, or survived as small communities among larger ruins. A monumental quarter might be buried while a nearby village continued. A palace might fill with sand while farmers reuse stones from its walls. A temple might stand abandoned for centuries, then become a shelter quarry shrine or landmark. Sand does not always mark the end of human presence. Sometimes it marks the end of one use and the beginning of another. Yet once sand enters a declining city, it changes how people relate to the place. Clearing a doorway is manageable. Clearing an entire street every season is harder. Restoring a canal filled for years may be beyond a small population. Reopening a buried well may be dangerous. People begin to choose which spaces matter enough to save. Outer neighborhoods are left to drift. Public squares become dumping grounds or animal pens. Houses are built against older walls, using them as windbreaks. The inhabited city contracts into islands among its own ruins. From above it might still look urban, but inside emptiness is growing. There is something almost intimate about this stage of decline. The desert enters domestic life. Sand lies in sleeping rooms. It gathers around grinding stones. It softens the edge of steps. It covers painted plaster storage jars, loom weights, and thresholds polished by generations of feet. It turns architecture into terrain. Children born during the shrinking years may know parts of the old city only as mounds. They may play on the roofline of houses whose rooms their grandparents remembered. A marketplace becomes a windbreak. A noble residence becomes a hill. The past is not gone, but it is no longer understood in the same way. No single explanation fully accounts for why some cities are deeply buried while others remain exposed. Local wind patterns matter. So does the amount of loose sediment, the durability of building materials, the shape of streets, later human disturbance rainfall, and whether ruins were reused or quarried. Stone cities may stand dramatically above the sand because their bones resist collapse. Mud brick cities may become low, tells their walls melting into rounded mounds. Some places are not so much buried by dunes as softened by dust-silt collapse, and time until only excavation can restore their plan. Sand can also protect against memory's destruction. A buried city may escape later building plunder or erosion precisely because it becomes inconvenient and invisible. Floors sealed by wind-blown deposits can preserve seeds that reveal ancient diets, insect remains that suggest storage conditions, and tiny fragments of daily life that would otherwise vanish. In this sense, sand is both destroyer and archivist. It hides the city from human memory, then saves pieces of it for future discovery. The same grains that close a doorway may preserve the last footprints inside. That double nature is part of the mystery's power. The desert seems to erase, but it also records. It covers not evenly, but selectively. A palace facade may remain exposed while workers' houses vanish. A temple tower may survive as a landmark while the streets around it disappear. Later visitors then misunderstand the city, seeing only monuments and imagining a place of kings, priests, or legends. Archaeology must dig back into the ordinary spaces where sand has kept the quieter evidence of cooks, children, traders, labourers, and animals. Buried cities are often more human below the surface than above it. Still, for those who lived through the process, there would have been little comfort in becoming well preserved. Sand meant blocked doors, failing channels, ruined fields, harder travel, and the visible sign that the city's struggle against its environment was no longer being won. Each uncleared drift announced a change in confidence. Each abandoned street gave the wind more room. Each roof collapse made the next layer easier. Burial was not just something that happened after abandonment. It could be part of abandonment itself, making return less likely with every season. So the moving sand should not be imagined as a single final disaster. It is better understood as a force waiting at the edge of maintenance. When people are numerous, organized, and hopeful, they hold it back without thinking much about the victory. When water fails, trade weakens, fields decline, or politics fracture, the same ordinary sand becomes powerful. It fills the spaces where human rhythm has stopped. It turns neglect into landscape. It converts a city from a place of action into a place of layers. And this is why the ruins rising from dunes feel so haunting. They are not merely places the desert conquered. They are places where the balance between movement and stillness finally tipped. Once hands swept thresholds clear each morning. Once canals were opened, roads crossed, animals, watered markets stirred, and children carried dust into houses on their feet. Then the sweeping slowed. The channels clogged. The road bent away. Wind entered rooms without permission. Grain by grain, the city passed from human time into desert time, where nothing is hurried and almost nothing is forgotten. The city that cannot drink does not always die loudly. Its end may begin with accounts, not screams. A scribe records a smaller delivery of grain. A household draws water before dawn because the line at the well grows longer after sunrise. A gardener leaves one terrace unplanted. A caravan master complains that animals must be watered in shifts. Priests or officials order repairs to a cistern, but the plaster cracks again when heat returns. In the outer quarter, a family closes its house for a season and moves closer to kin near a better spring. The door is not sealed as if forever, it is simply pulled shut. A few months pass, sand gathers against it. Water failure is rarely a single empty well. More often it is a loss of confidence in the whole water world. The source may still exist, but it no longer feels dependable enough to support the same population, the same fields, the same animals, the same ambitions. A city can survive thirst for a day a week, even a terrible season if it has storage and neighbours. What it cannot easily survive is a future in which everyone knows the old system no longer promises return. Once that belief breaks, the city begins to shrink in the mind before it shrinks on the ground. Petra offers a powerful window into this problem, even though its story is more complex than simple water failure. The Nabateans built a city of astonishing skill in a landscape where water had to be captured, guided, and stored. Their dams, channels, cisterns, and rock-cut conduits turned dangerous flash floods into usable supply. For centuries, this system supported an urban centre tied to trade ritual and royal power. But Petra's later decline involved many pressures shifting trade routes, changing political authority under Roman rule, earthquakes, altered economic networks, and the challenge of maintaining infrastructure in a city whose original strategic advantages were weakening. Scholars still debate the weight of each factor. Yet water remains central because in such a place prosperity and survival both depended on constant hydraulic care. A city like Petra does not have to run completely dry to lose population. If trade weakens, fewer resources are available to maintain waterworks. If earthquakes damage channels or dams repair demands organization. If political attention moves elsewhere, local systems may receive less investment. If surrounding agricultural areas become less productive, the urban centre becomes harder to sustain. The result is not one dramatic collapse, but a slow reduction of capacity. Monumental tombs remain carved into cliffs with a permanence human institutions rarely possess, while the living systems around them fade. The stones endure longer than the arrangements that made the stones possible. In other desert and oasis cities, the pattern appears in different materials. Some settlements depend on a river branch that shifts course. The city does not move at first, the water does. Fields closest to the old channel suffer. Canals must be extended, deepened, or abandoned. If the population is strong and authority organized, the city may adapt. If not, districts become less viable. In Central Asian oasis systems, the movement of rivers and the management of irrigation could determine whether a town remained connected to life or became stranded beside dry channels. Later sand burial may make the abandonment look like a desert invasion, but the first betrayal may have been a river turning away. At the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, several ancient settlements tell versions of this story. Places such as Nia Lulan and other oasis sites have been associated with shifting watercourses, changing environmental conditions, and the fragility of life along desert margins. The details vary and the evidence remains incomplete, but the broader lesson is clear. A settlement can thrive where a river fans into fields and orchards, then decline when the channel migrates, water becomes less reliable, or the administrative and trade systems supporting the oasis weaken. Wooden tablets document textiles and domestic remains, recovered from some of these sites, show not fantasy cities swallowed overnight, but communities embedded in work-law agriculture and long-distance exchange. Their disappearance from the map is not a single mystery. It is the end result of systems no longer aligning. The city that cannot drink also reveals how inequality shapes survival. When water grows scarce, it is not felt evenly. Elite households may have private storage, better access political connections, or the ability to relocate without losing everything. Poorer families may depend on public wells, shared canals, and daily labour. Farmers at the tail end of an irrigation system suffer before those near the head. Herders with fewer animals may lose their livelihood first. Craftsmen who need water for production may find their work impossible before the wealthy abandon luxury. A city's decline can therefore look quiet from the viewpoint of monuments, while becoming severe in ordinary neighbourhoods. The grand buildings still stand, the vulnerable leave first. There is a lesser-known form of water failure that has little to do with absolute quantity. Water can become brackish. It can carry more salts. It can be contaminated by poor drainage crowding or the breakdown of maintenance. A well may still produce liquid that is increasingly unpleasant or harmful. Fields may still receive irrigation that slowly reduces fertility. Animals may tolerate what humans dislike, or humans may tolerate what visitors refuse. This kind of decline leaves subtle traces. Mineral crusts, soil chemistry, crop changes and settlement shifts may hint at it, but certainty is difficult. What survives in the record suggests that water quality, not only water amount, could shape the fate of settlements in arid regions. The administrative burden of water is equally important. A canal network is a social machine. Someone must decide when gates open, how labour is assigned, how disputes are settled, and how repairs are funded. In good times, the machine may seem natural, almost invisible. In bad times, every decision becomes contested. If the head of the canal takes too much, the tail dries. If officials demand labour during harvest, resentment grows. If taxes are assessed according to old expectations, farmers under new scarcity fall into debt. If migrants arrive from drier areas, pressure increases. Water failure is therefore not only hydrological, it becomes legal, political, and moral. This is why many ancient texts from arid societies show deep concern with measurement rights, boundaries, and obligations. Even when the specific documents do not survive for a buried city, archaeology often reveals the same reality. Fields are laid out with care. Channels branch in planned ways. Storage facilities imply central control or communal organization. Fortified points protect wells or routes. These things show that water was not merely found, it was administered. When administration weakens, water systems can fail, even if the environment has not changed dramatically. A broken state can make a manageable drought catastrophic. The reverse is also true. A resilient community can survive severe environmental pressure if its institutions are flexible and trusted. It can reduce planting rationed, fairly repair critical infrastructure, import grain move herds, and preserve enough people to recover. The difference between hardship and abandonment may lie in social cooperation as much as rainfall. No single explanation fully accounts for why one oasis survives while another becomes a ruin. The answer often lies in the difficult meeting point between climate and society. A city under water stress may also become more exposed to disease and conflict. Crowding around fewer sources increases contamination risk. Malnutrition weakens bodies. Disputes over access can harden into violence. Outsiders may see weakness and attack. Rulers may impose harsher controls to maintain order, driving more people away. Merchants may avoid a place known for scarcity, further reducing income. The inability to drink enough clean water spreads outward into every part of urban life. The market weakens, the road weakens, the fields weaken, faith in the city weakens, and still people may stay for a long time. Attachment to place is not easily broken. Ancestors are buried there. Houses hold memory. Shrines hold vows. Fields represent generations of labour. A city is not abandoned the moment it becomes inconvenient. People repair, improvise, argue, hope, and endure. They may move seasonally. They may occupy only part of the old settlement. They may convert public buildings into domestic spaces. They may live among ruins left by their own grandparents. Archaeologists often find these late phases fascinating because they show adaptation rather than simple collapse. A declining city remains a human place, not merely a failed one. But when the water problem becomes too deep, the end gathers force. The outer farms go first, then the workshops depending on surplus, then the caravan services, then public repair. Roofs fail, cistern mouths clog, animals are taken elsewhere. A few wells remain in use perhaps by travellers or small groups long after the city's urban life has ended. The name may survive among nomads, merchants, or later villagers as a place of ruins, danger spirits, or old kings. The actual city, however, loses its daily pulse. When sand finally fills the streets, it covers not only stone but decisions. It hides the moment when one family chose to leave, when a canal was not cleared, when a well was judged too poor, when a caravan passed by without stopping, when a governor no longer sent funds, when a field was left unplanted because hope had become too expensive. These are the real events of decline, but they rarely leave inscriptions. They survive as patterns in dust. The city that cannot drink teaches that collapse is not always the opposite of achievement. Sometimes the more sophisticated a water system is, the more vulnerable it becomes to neglect, disruption, or changes beyond its design. The canals and cisterns are proof of brilliance, but also proof of dependence. They show how much had to go right every year for life to continue. When enough things went wrong, the desert did not need to invent a catastrophe. It only had to inherit the silence. A desert city can survive bad weather, poor harvests, and even years of weak trade if the wider world around it still holds together. What often breaks it is not one pressure, but the arrival of human disorder at the very moment the landscape is already difficult. War does not need to bury a city in sand by itself. Empire does not need to dry a well with its own hands. But conquest, taxation, frontier collapse raids, and political neglect can weaken the systems that keep sand, thirst, and distance under control. In arid country, peace is not merely pleasant, it is infrastructure. A caravan road depends on trust. Merchants do not require a world without danger, because such a world has never existed, but they need danger to be known, priced, and managed. They need guards, treaties, way stations, water rights, predictable tolls, and some confidence that the ruler at one end of a road will still matter when they reach the other. When empires are strong, they can make deserts more passable. They build forts, patrol routes, protect wells, regulate markets, and punish raiders. They also demand taxes, tribute animals, labour, and loyalty. A city under imperial protection may prosper, but it also becomes tied to imperial appetite. When that appetite grows too heavy, prosperity thins. When imperial protection disappears, the exposed city may discover how much of its confidence came from power beyond its walls. This is one reason ruined desert cities often carry traces of several worlds layered together. A local kingdom rises because it controls water and movement. A larger empire absorbs it. New roads are favoured. Old elites adapt coins and inscriptions, change military posts appear, and taxes are redirected. Sometimes the city benefits. Sometimes it loses the particular advantage that made it wealthy. Petra's incorporation into the Roman world did not instantly destroy it, and scholars still debate the pace and causes of its later decline, but the larger trade system changed around it. Routes, ports, administrative priorities, and regional economies shifted. A city that once stood at the centre of a network may remain beautiful while becoming less necessary. War can be more direct. A siege damages walls, burns quarters, kills livestock, scatters skilled workers, and drains stored grain. Even if the city is not completely destroyed, recovery requires labour and confidence. Canals must be repaired, fields replanted, trade reassured, families persuaded to return. In wetter regions, a damaged city may still draw on surrounding agricultural abundance. In a desert margin, the delay itself can be fatal. 1 or 2 seasons without maintenance can fill channels, ruin terraces, and allow dunes to enter spaces that once were cleared daily. Violence may last a month. Its environmental consequences may last generations. There is a brutal lesson in the history of Merv, one of the great oasis cities of Central Asia. For centuries, the Merv oasis supported major urban centres, benefiting from irrigation's strategic location and its place in networks of empire scholarship and trade. It was not a single city frozen in time, but a shifting urban landscape with successive walled centres. Then came the Mongol conquest in the 13th century, remembered in historical sources as devastating on a vast scale. The exact numbers reported by medieval writers are often exaggerated or difficult to verify, and the evidence must be handled carefully, but there is little doubt that the destruction was severe. Yet even there, the story is not simply an army arrives and sand follows. The deeper issue is what happens when the people, institutions, and irrigation systems that sustain an oasis are shattered. Water must be managed continuously. If the social body that manages it is broken, the landscape begins to change. Political collapse also rearranges labour. A canal network may depend on corvée workers, paid crews, local obligations, or temple and state authority. If rulers fall, who organises cleaning? If tax collectors flee, who funds repairs? If landowners are killed or displaced, who mediates access? If soldiers become bandits, who dares to travel to outer fields? A city may appear physically intact after a war, but the invisible agreements that made it function can be gone. The buildings remain like a body after the breath has left. Taxation can wound more slowly. Empires often see productive oasis lands as revenue sources, especially because irrigated fields can be measured, assessed, and controlled. In good years, taxes may be burdensome but bearable. In dry years, fixed demands become dangerous. Farmers borrow grain, sell animals, abandon fields, or flee. Officials may intensify extraction precisely when the system needs relief. What survives in the record from various ancient and medieval societies suggests that debt tax pressure and land concentration could reshape rural life under stress. For a desert city, this matters because the urban centre depends on a healthy ring of fields and villages. If that ring weakens, the walls are only a shell. Trade disruption is another form of political violence, even without battle. A border closes, a rival power controls a pass. A new dynasty favours a different customs point. Pirates or raiders make a connecting route uncertain. Religious or diplomatic shifts alter pilgrimage and exchange. Merchants are practical. They may honour old relationships, but they will not repeatedly risk ruin for nostalgia. Once caravans choose another road, revenue falls. Once revenue falls, maintenance suffers. Once maintenance suffers, water and sand begin their work. The decision of merchants far away may eventually appear in a ruined city as a buried street. There is also the pressure of militarization. Forts require supplies. Garrisons require water. Armies passing through consume grain animals, timber and fodder at frightening speed. A city on a frontier may profit from military spending during stable periods, then suffer terribly when campaigns intensify. Soldiers can protect wells, but they can also exhaust them. They can guard roads, but they can also requisition the animals needed for trade. They can bring coin disease and fear in the same column. No single explanation fully accounts for the fate of cities on imperial edges, because frontiers are unstable by nature. They are places where protection and predation can look almost the same. The human experience of political decline would have been uneven. Elites might negotiate with new rulers, change languages of administration, marry into incoming powers, or move their wealth elsewhere. Merchants might shift operations while leaving agents behind. Farmers and labourers had fewer choices. They remained exposed to taxes, raids, conscription and hunger. In archaeological layers, this may appear as poorer repairs, abandoned outer districts, makeshift walls, hidden valuables, burned destruction layers, or sudden changes in material culture. But the silence after violence can be harder to read than the violence itself. A burned building tells one story. A canal not cleaned after the burning tells the longer one. Fringe legends often imagine buried cities as punished by gods or annihilated by mysterious forces, because the sight of abandonment feels too total for ordinary causes. But ordinary causes multiplied and sustained are more than enough. A tax demand at the wrong moment, a failed alliance, a raiding season, a damaged dam, a trade route redirected by a cautious merchant class, a local authority unable to compel repair. None seems mythical. Together, they can end an urban world. And when people leave for reasons of war or rule, they may intend to return. They may store goods, bury valuables, close houses, or leave shrines intact. They may expect the conflict to pass the soldiers, to move on the governor, to be replaced the route to reopen. Sometimes return happens, sometimes it does not. Years stretch, roofs fail, wells clog, children grow up elsewhere. The old city becomes a place spoken of in family memory, then in travellers' tales, then in uncertain names on old roads. Sand covers the hesitation as completely as it covers destruction. Empire can build cities in deserts because empire can concentrate labour and secure movement. It can also abandon them because empire always has priorities elsewhere. When the centre shifts, the margin feels it first. A city once maintained as a strategic jewel may become too expensive, too remote, too politically inconvenient, or simply less useful than another route. The desert then reveals a truth that all empires prefer to forget. Control is temporary, but maintenance is forever. So will conquest and political collapse do not replace water, climate, trade, or land use as explanations. They sharpen them. They break the routines that made difficulty manageable. They interrupt the clearing of sand, the repairing of canals, the guarding of roads, the fairness of water distribution, the confidence of merchants, and the willingness of families to remain. In a desert city, civilization is not only built from walls and wealth, it is built from continuity. Once continuity breaks, the landscape begins to collect what power can no longer hold. The myth of the vanished city is almost always faster than the real city's end. In the myth, people are feasting, trading, praying and sleeping under familiar roofs when the desert suddenly rises. By morning, towers are gone, wells are sealed, streets disappear. Only a legend remains carried by frightened survivors or by travellers who refuse to cross the cursed ground. It is a powerful story because it satisfies something deep in the human imagination. It turns slow failure into a single image. It gives history the shape of judgment. It makes the desert an actor with intention, almost a living force that decides when a city has stood long enough. But archaeology is rarely so theatrical. It usually finds hesitation, reuse partial abandonment, repair adaptation and long decline. A room fills with sand, but another nearby remains occupied. A grand building falls out of use while smaller houses are built against its walls. A canal is blocked, then cleared, then blocked again. Imported luxuries decline, but local pottery continues. Burials appear in unexpected places, not because the city vanished in one night, but because the meaning of space changed over time. The city does not disappear like a lamp blown out. It dims unevenly. This does not mean sudden disasters never happened. Earthquakes could damage cities badly, especially where water channels, dams, and buildings depended on fragile alignments. Floods could tear through wadis, rip open streets, and fill low areas with debris. Sandstorms could bury entrances, kill animals, and disorient travelers. War could destroy neighborhoods in days. But even when a sudden event struck, the deeper question remains: why did the city not fully recover? Ancient cities were often damaged and rebuilt many times. A disaster becomes a turning point only when the community no longer has the resources, population, political stability, or confidence to restore what was lost. That distinction matters because the eye loves ruins more than processes. A broken wall is easier to imagine than a weakened tax base. A buried doorway is easier to film than a slow decline in caravan traffic. A collapsed cistern feels more dramatic than decades of poor maintenance. Yet the real reason cities were buried in sand often lies in processes that leave quieter traces. The myth selects the final image and mistakes it for the cause. The sand is there, so the sand must have destroyed the city. The truth is often that the city became vulnerable first and the sand completed a longer story. The legend sometimes grows because later travelers encounter ruins without context. They see columns, half-buried inscriptions, no one nearby can read, walls running into dunes and tombs standing over empty valleys. Without the records of ordinary life, imagination fills the gap. A city must have been cursed, its people must have angered heaven, a king must have been too proud, a storm must have swallowed it whole. Such stories are not merely foolish. They are ways of explaining a landscape that seems to contain evidence of both greatness and warning. The ruins demand a moral, and people provide one. The so-called lost city of Ubar, often linked in popular imagination with the Atlantis of the Sands, shows how powerful and complicated this pattern can be. Tales of a wealthy desert city destroyed or lost in the sands circulated in connection with Arabian traditions, later exploration, and modern enthusiasm. Archaeological work at sites such as Shissa in Oman revealed remains tied to trade, water, and settlement activity, including a collapse associated with a limestone cavern beneath a fort-like structure. But the popular version often runs far beyond the evidence. Scholars still debate identification, scale, and interpretation. What is clear is that the romance of a city swallowed by sand can overshadow the more grounded story of trade routes, water sources, settlement limits, and changing use of a place. This is a recurring problem. A name survives in a text. A ruin appears in a desert. A dramatic theory joins them. Sometimes the connection is plausible, sometimes it is weak, sometimes it is useful as a starting point but dangerous as a conclusion. Ancient geography is full of partial names, shifting locations, repeated place names, exaggerations, and political language. A city described as wealthy may have been a regional centre, not a glittering metropolis. A destruction described as total may have been literary emphasis. A place said to be lost may have remained known to local people all along, only rediscovered by outsiders who did not recognize local memory as knowledge. That last point is important. Many buried or ruined cities were never truly lost to everyone. Nearby communities, pastoral groups, guides, pilgrims, or local farmers often knew of them. They may not have known the ancient name, or they may have used a different one, but the stones were part of lived geography. Outsiders later arrived, mapped, photographed, excavated, and announced discovery. The language of discovery can unintentionally erase the people who had long moved through those landscapes. What survives in the record, therefore, includes not only ancient uncertainty, but modern habits of storytelling. The myth of sudden vanishing also simplifies human response. It imagines a passive population overwhelmed in an instant. Real communities made choices. They moved goods, shifted neighborhoods, repaired what they could, changed occupations, buried their dead, reused old buildings, followed water, negotiated with new powers, and carried memories elsewhere. Decline was not always helplessness. Sometimes it was strategy. Sometimes the city died because its people lived by leaving. Archaeology often reveals this through reuse. A palace becomes a shelter. A temple courtyard becomes a place for animals. Fine stone is removed and built into humbler walls. Streets narrow as houses expand into public space. A monumental gate is blocked or bypassed. These details can feel like decay, but they are also evidence of practical intelligence. People do not always preserve old grandeur when they need a roof, a pen, a wall, or a hearth. To later admirers, reuse may look like disrespect. To those living through hard years, it is survival. No single explanation fully accounts for why legends prefer sudden endings, but part of the answer may be emotional. Slow collapse is harder to face. It suggests that civilizations can fail without a clear villain, without a single day, when everything changes without a warning loud enough for everyone to hear. It suggests that ordinary decisions, postponed repairs, weakened institutions, bad luck, environmental pressure and political neglect can accumulate until return becomes impossible. A sudden catastrophe is frightening, but it is also clean. Slow unravelling is more disturbing because it resembles life. There is also the problem of archaeological visibility. Sudden destruction can leave dramatic layers, ash-smashed vessels, fallen beams, bodies trapped in place. Slow abandonment may leave fewer spectacular signs. People take valuables with them. Houses are emptied. Materials are reused. Rooms fill gradually. The very absence of drama can tempt later storytellers to invent it. A city without a fiery end may be more historically accurate but less satisfying to the imagination. Sand strengthens the illusion because it smooths complexity. It covers different phases with the same surface. A district abandoned in one century and another abandoned later can appear as one dead city. A ruin reused by shepherds, monks, soldiers or villagers may be seen only as ancient, not as a palimpsest of many lives. The desert's surface hides sequence. Excavation restores sequence grain by grain, layer by layer, and often the restored story is more intricate than legend allows. The real mystery, then, is not whether cities were ever buried. They were. The mystery is how long they remained alive while already becoming ruins. How many years did people walk past abandoned walls on their way to still functioning wells? How many children grew up in the shadow of monuments whose original meaning had faded? How many families stayed after merchants left, after officials departed, after outer fields failed? These are harder questions than asking what swallowed the city because they require seeing decline as lived experience. And once seen this way, the buried city becomes more moving. It is not a stage for a single spectacular doom. It is a record of endurance under pressure. It shows people refusing to surrender immediately to dryness, distance, war, or poverty. It shows repair before abandonment, adaptation before silence, memory before forgetting. The sand did not erase a moment. It covered a long argument between human beings and the conditions that had once made their city possible. The myth will always survive because dunes against ruins seem to invite it. A half-buried tower at sunset appears to belong to legend. A carved doorway opening into sand feels like a warning from a vanished age. But beneath that image lies a slower truth. Cities are not usually swallowed because the desert suddenly becomes powerful. They are buried when the human systems that once resisted ordinary sand can no longer continue. The end is not a thunderclap. It is the day no one clears the threshold, followed by another day and another until the doorway is no longer a doorway at all. The work of finding a buried city begins with suspicion. Not certainty, not revelation, but a small mismatch in the landscape. A mound rises where the plain should be flat. A line of stones runs too straight to be natural. A dune has a hard edge beneath it. Pottery fragments appear after rain. A local story points toward a place where animals stumble on old walls. From the ground, the signs can seem almost accidental. From above, they may become clearer pale rectangles under sand-dark lines where buried walls hold moisture differently. Faint grids where streets once cut through neighborhoods, old canals drawn across the earth like veins that have forgotten their water. Modern archaeology has changed the way buried cities are seen, but it has not removed the mystery. Satellites, aerial photography, ground-penetrating radar magnetometry, drone surveys, sediment analysis and computer mapping can reveal patterns invisible to the naked eye. They can show where a wall may lie before anyone digs. They can trace ancient irrigation systems across kilometers of desert. They can identify buried roads, field boundaries, fortifications and river channels. Yet these tools do not explain everything by themselves. They reveal shapes. Human interpretation must still ask what those shapes meant when they were made, how they changed, and why they were abandoned. The first clue is often pottery. It is humble, broken, and nearly everywhere people once lived. A painted sherd, a storage jar rim, a cooking pot base, a fragment of glazed ware or plain household ceramic can help date occupation, identify trade contacts, and distinguish a wealthy quarter from a poorer one. Pottery travels in ways people do through markets, migration, tribute imitation, and local habit. A city with many imported ceramics may have been plugged into wide networks. A later layer with fewer imports may suggest shrinking exchange, though scholars still debate such evidence carefully because changes in fashion or production can mislead. Still, a broken pot can speak with more honesty than a royal inscription because it belonged to ordinary use. Bones speak too, though quietly. Animal bones reveal diet, herding, trade status, and environmental pressure. A rise in goat or sheep remains may suggest changing pasture strategies. Camel bones may point toward caravan life. Fish bones in a desert city may reveal trade links or past waterways. Human bones, when studied respectfully and cautiously, can show stress, disease, diet, injury, migration, and sometimes violence. But bones never tell the whole story. They preserve some lives better than others, and the evidence remains incomplete. Archaeology is always partly an art of listening to what survived by chance. Seeds, pollen, charcoal, and tiny plant remains can be even more revealing. They show what people ate, what they cultivated, what grew nearby, what fuel they burned, and how vegetation changed over time. A layer rich in date pits, barley grains, grape seeds, or cotton. Remains can open a window into fields that no longer exist. Pollen trapped in sediments may suggest wetter conditions, cultivated gardens, reeds near water, or the spread of desert plants. Charcoal can reveal which trees or shrubs were cut for fuel. These fragments are small, but they carry whole landscapes inside them. Then there are canals, the buried signatures of effort. From the surface, an old irrigation system may look like shallow ridges and depressions hardly worth attention. Mapped carefully, it becomes a diagram of social life. The main channel shows where water entered. Branches show distribution. Field patterns show planning. Sediment inside channels can reveal whether water flowed regularly, whether floods brought silt, whether maintenance stopped suddenly or gradually. A canal filled with wind-blown sand may suggest abandonment, but not by itself. It must be read with field settlements, climate records, and artifacts nearby. No single line in the earth explains a city's end. Inscriptions and documents add names, but names can mislead as much as they illuminate. A stone inscription may celebrate a ruler repairing a dam, founding a temple, or securing a road. A wooden tablet may record taxes, contracts, land, or officials. A papyrus clay tablet or manuscript may preserve complaints, trade accounts, religious dedications, or military orders. These sources are precious because they bring human voices close, but they are also partial. Officials write from the viewpoint of authority. Merchants record what matters to business. Religious texts frame events through belief. Royal inscriptions often exaggerate order, victory, and generosity. The silence of the poor remains difficult to overcome. One of the most powerful modern tools is the view from above. Satellite imagery can reveal ancient routes that are almost invisible on foot. In deserts where vegetation is sparse, buried features sometimes leave subtle marks in color, texture, or elevation. Old riverbeds can be traced across dry basins. Caravan tracks may appear as faint braided lines. Forts line up along corridors. Field systems appear like faded nets. In some cases, remote sensing has transformed understanding of entire regions, showing that places once assumed to be isolated ruins were parts of dense networks of farms, roads, wells, and satellite settlements. The city under sand is rarely alone. It belongs to a landscape of labor, but excavation remains the slow confrontation with detail. A trench opens. Sand is removed layer by layer. Tools become smaller as the work approaches floors. A wall appears, then a doorway, then a hearth, then ash, then a scatter of beads, seeds, bones, and broken vessels. The city becomes intimate again. Not grand at first, but domestic. A storage jar lies on its side. A floor has been repaired more than once. A doorway was narrowed. A room was abandoned, filled, then reused. These details can overturn the myth of sudden disappearance. They show time inside ruin. The most difficult clue is absence, a missing layer of occupation, a gap in imports, a canal left uncleared, a district no longer repaired. Absence must be handled with caution because not finding something does not prove it never existed. Later erosion may remove evidence. Excavation may miss the relevant area. Poor communities may leave fewer durable goods. Yet patterns of absence repeated across a site can become meaningful. They show contraction, disruption, or change priorities. In the study of buried cities, what is not there can be almost as important as what is found. Scholars still debate many interpretations because evidence from deserts can be both beautifully preserved and deeply deceptive. Dryness can save textiles, wood documents, and organic materials that would rot elsewhere. At the same time, wind can move objects, erosion can strip layers, and later reuse can disturb earlier contexts. A coin may be found far from where it circulated. A text may survive in a dump, not an archive. A sand-filled room may preserve a moment, or it may contain materials swept in over decades. Archaeology resists easy certainty. Still, the methods together create a powerful picture. A buried city is not discovered once. It is discovered repeatedly through survey, excavation, laboratory analysis, comparison, and debate. The first discovery may be the wall under the sand. The second is the water system. The third is the trade network. The fourth is the environmental history. The fifth is the human rhythm of expansion, stress, adaptation, and decline. Each layer corrects the last. The surprising truth is that modern science often makes ancient cities less mysterious in one sense and more mysterious in another. It may show that a ruin was not destroyed by a single storm, not lost overnight, not built by unknown superhuman engineers, not erased by a curse. But it also reveals complexity so deep that simple answers become impossible. Climate shifts, river changes, taxation, soil chemistry, trade routes, household decisions, and wind patterns all meet in the same buried street. The mystery does not disappear, it becomes more human, and perhaps that is the real value of the clues under the surface. They return the city from legend to life. They show that the people who lived there were not shadows waiting to vanish. They were builders, farmers, officials, children, traders, cooks, water carriers, herders, mourners, and migrants. Their world ended not because history demanded a dramatic scene, but because systems they depended on changed beyond repair. The sand covered the evidence, but it did not destroy every trace. Beneath it, the city still keeps accounts, meals, repairs, mistakes, ambitions, and small acts of endurance. Every excavation is therefore an act of translation. The archaeologist reads dunes as pages, walls as grammar potsherds, as syllables, canals as long sentences written across the land. The translation is never complete. Some words are missing, some meanings remain uncertain, some debates will continue, but enough can be read to understand that buried cities are not empty monuments to failure. They are archives of fragile success. They tell how people made life possible in difficult places and how difficult places remembered when the making stopped. Names survive badly in the desert. Stone may last, walls may endure, and pottery may wait beneath the surface for 1,000 years. But names drift, split, vanish, and attach themselves to the wrong places. A city can be famous in one age, half remembered in another, and nameless in the third. Later travellers may give it a new name based on a nearby village, a shrine, a colour of rock, a legend, or a misunderstanding. Ancient texts may preserve a name without a map precise enough to locate it. Local memory may know the ruins, but not the empire that built them. This is why buried cities often seem to hover between history and myth. Their stones are real. Their names are sometimes less certain. Petra is an exception in one sense because it never fully vanished from human knowledge. Its carved facades remained in the cliffs, and local people knew the place long before European travellers made it famous in the 19th century. Yet even Petra shows how a city can be reduced by memory. The visible grandeur encourages people to imagine it only as a place of tombs and spectacle, when it was also a working city of water, channels, houses, workshops, religious spaces, markets, agriculture, and political negotiation. The surviving stone emphasizes the monumental. The buried or eroded ordinary life must be patiently recovered. Without archaeology, the city becomes a beautiful mask. The legend of Ubar, or the so-called Atlantis of the Sands, shows the opposite problem, a powerful name seeking a definite city. For decades, explorers, writers, and enthusiasts imagined a lost Arabian metropolis swallowed by dunes, wealthy from incense and destroyed by catastrophe. Sites in Oman, especially around Shissa, have been linked to this tradition, and archaeological work has shown settlement activity, trade connections, water use, and structural collapse in a desert context. But the grand popular image remains disputed. The evidence does not support every dramatic claim made about a glittering city suddenly buried whole. What survives suggests something more grounded, and in many ways more revealing, a place tied to roots, water, and changing patterns of use later magnified by legend into a symbol of vanished wealth. Merv offers another kind of survival. It is not a single lost city, but an enormous archaeological landscape, a sequence of cities built, expanded, abandoned, and replaced across time in the Murghab oasis. Its ruins speak of Achaemenid, Hellenistic, Parthian, Sasanian, Islamic, and later histories layered across the same region. At its height, it was one of the great urban centres of the Eastern Islamic world, associated with scholarship, trade gardens, walls, and power. Its later devastation under the Mongols became part of historical memory, sometimes described in numbers too vast to trust literally yet clearly marking severe destruction. Still, Merv's deeper story is not only massacre, it is the long dependence of urban greatness on oasis irrigation, imperial networks, and the ability to manage water in a shifting landscape. The Silk Road desert settlements of the Tarim Basin preserve still another pattern. Names such as Lulan and Nia evoke ruins along the edges of one of the harshest deserts on Earth, where wooden documents, textiles, houses, and refuse have survived in extraordinary dryness. These places were not imaginary cities swallowed in an instant. They were administrative and agricultural communities tied to roots, rivers, and oasis ecologies. Their remains show law, labor, farming, writing, trade, and everyday settlement. Changes in river courses, environmental stress, political shifts, and the movement of trade all appear to have played roles in their decline, though scholars still debate the details. Their ruins are haunting because they feel suspended wooden posts, documents, and domestic objects preserved in a world that no longer supports the same kind of life. In Egypt's western desert oasis, towns and temple settlements reveal how imperial power reached into arid landscapes through wells, agriculture, military posts, and religious institutions. The Dakhla and Karga oases, for example, contain ancient settlements, cemeteries, temples, and traces of long occupation. They were not simply isolated outposts. They were connected to Nile Valley politics, desert routes, and local agricultural systems. Some sites endured for long periods, changing with the Egyptian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and later worlds. Others shrank or shifted as water administration and routes changed. Here again, the desert does not offer one simple story. It preserves a patchwork of persistence and abandonment. In North Africa, cities and fortified settlements along Saharan and trans-Saharan routes show how trade could sustain communities far from coasts and rivers. Garama, associated with the Garamantes in the Fezzan region of Libya, is especially important because it challenges the old image of the Sahara as merely empty. The Garamantes built settlements, managed water through foggara-like systems, practiced agriculture, and participated in long-distance exchange. Their world depended on groundwater labor and networks across desert space. The decline of such systems involved environmental, social, and political pressures that remain debated. But their ruins make one point unmistakable. Desert societies were not marginal shadows of river civilizations. They were inventive, organized, and deeply adapted to their landscapes. Even where names are lost, stones preserve habits. A city wall tells of fear or authority. A granary tells of storage and planning. A bathhouse tells of water control status and social life. A caravanserai tells of travelers and animals. A shrine tells of devotion that may have outlasted political power. A collapsed roof tells of the day maintenance stopped. These features do not need famous names to matter. Many buried settlements will never become symbols like Petra or Merv, yet they may reveal more about ordinary survival than grand capitals do. The unknown town half under sand may show how most people actually lived at the desert's edge. The difficulty is that modern attention often follows spectacle. A carved facade draws the eye. A dramatic legend sells the story. A city associated with a famous empire becomes easier to place in a documentary than a nameless cluster of mud brick mounds. But the real history of buried cities depends on the less famous sites too. They show networks rather than isolated marvels. They show that every great desert city relied on smaller settlements, wells fields, watch posts, and seasonal routes. A capital without its hinterland is only a monument. A trade city without its road stations is only a ruin waiting to be misunderstood. What survives in the record suggests that the same processes repeat with local variations. Water creates possibility. Trade increases importance. Power organizes and exploits the system. Land use strains the surrounding environment. Climate shifts or river changes reduce resilience. Political disruption weakens maintenance. Sand enters when human rhythm slows. But every city combines these forces differently. In one place, trade may be decisive. In another, watercourse change. In another, conquest. In another, soil exhaustion. The temptation to ask for the real reason in the singular is understandable, but the ruins resist it. There is also a moral danger in treating buried cities only as warnings. They are warnings, but they are not merely failures. Petra's waterworks, Merv's oasis urbanism, Tarim Basin documents Garamantian irrigation, Saharan trade towns and countless smaller settlements show generations of success under conditions that were never easy. Their people did not build ruins, they built functioning worlds. The fact that those worlds ended does not erase the intelligence that sustained them. All cities end eventually, whether by sand, sea fire, conquest, neglect, or transformation. The question is not why ancient people failed to achieve permanence. No one has achieved permanence. Still, the desert makes impermanence visible with unusual clarity. In wetter places, later cities often cover earlier ones. Fields are replowed, forests grow, rivers deposit mud. Modern construction eats the past. In deserts, abandonment can remain exposed or sealed, creating the illusion that time stopped. A wall stands in emptiness. A street lies below a dune. A document survives because dryness spared it. The city seems both lost and present. It becomes a conversation between survival and disappearance. Lost names and surviving stones therefore belong together. The name is memory fragile and human. The stone is material stubborn but mute. Archaeology tries to reunite them, but it cannot always succeed. Sometimes the best it can do is restore the life without the name to show that people were there, that water flowed, that animals passed, that grain was stored, that hands repaired walls, that children grew up in courtyards now filled with dust. A nameless ruin is not an empty one. It is a city whose final silence has outlasted its vocabulary, and as each buried place is studied, the larger pattern sharpens. The desert did not simply swallow cities because deserts are cruel. It preserved the remains of human negotiations with scarcity, opportunity, and change. Some negotiations lasted centuries. Some produced beauty still capable of stopping the breath. Some ended in abandonment so gradual that no one alive at the time may have recognized the exact moment when the city ceased to be itself. The stones survive, but they do not shout. They wait for someone to notice that beneath the sand the old world is not gone. It is only speaking in a slower language. After the merchants leave, after the officials withdraw, after the outer fields become too difficult to water, a city does not necessarily become empty. This is one of the most important truths hidden by the phrase abandoned city. It suggests a clean break, as if everyone walked away at once and left the streets to wind. But many ancient cities passed through long afterlives. People stayed behind among shrinking neighborhoods, reused monumental buildings, tended a few wells, grazed animals in former courtyards, and lived beside ruins that had once been the proud center of their world. The city became smaller before it became silent. Those who stayed were not always the poorest, though often they had the fewest choices. Some families remained because their ancestors were buried nearby. Some because they controlled a reliable water source. Some because trade, though reduced, had not disappeared entirely. Some because temple shrines or local obligations still mattered. Some because leaving required animals money, kinship ties, and courage they did not have. A city is not only an economic machine. It is memory made physical. People do not abandon memory lightly. In the late life of a desert city, space changes meaning. A grand avenue may become a track between inhabited pockets. A public square may be used for animals. A wealthy house may be divided into smaller rooms by rough walls. A temple enclosure may shelter households, storage, or workshops. Stones from old monuments may be carried away to build humbler structures. To modernize, this can look like decay. To the people doing it, it is practical adaptation. A carved block is useful if it can strengthen a wall. A fallen column can mark a boundary. The old city becomes a quarry, a shelter, a windbreak, and a landscape of memory all at once. This reuse can make archaeology difficult. Later inhabitants disturb earlier floors, move objects, dig pits, repair walls badly, and mix materials from different periods. But they also reveal continuity. Their presence shows that urban decline is not the same as human disappearance. A capital may die while a village survives inside it. A market may close while a shrine remains active. A caravan city may lose international trade but continue as a local settlement. What survives in the record suggests that many so-called lost cities were not lost to their last inhabitants at all. They were simply no longer what they had been. The emotional world of those remaining is harder to recover, but traces exist. A patched roof suggests someone expected another season. A storage jar set into a floor suggests planning. A hearth built in the corner of a once formal room suggests domestic life continuing under reduced circumstances. A burial placed near or inside older ruins suggests attachment necessity or changing ritual practice. A child's toy bead or small footprint in hardened mud can make the late city feel painfully close. Decline is not abstract there. It is a family arranging ordinary life in the shadow of a larger past. Migration, when it came, was not always far. People might move from one district to another, from a failing canal zone to a better watered village, from a city centre to an oasis edge, from farming to herding, from permanent settlement to seasonal movement. They might join relatives in a nearby town or follow a trade road to a place where work remained. The archaeological record may show abandonment at one site and growth at another, but connecting the two is difficult. The evidence remains incomplete. People on the move often leave fewer durable traces than people in houses. This matters because disappearance from one place can be survival at another. A city may look like a failure when viewed from its walls, but its inhabitants may have adapted successfully by leaving. They carried skills, stories, gods, family names, seeds, tools, and habits with them. Some memories may have entered oral traditions. Some may have faded after a generation. Some may have attached themselves to new places. The stones stayed, but the culture did not necessarily end where the city ended. There is a quiet dignity in these late phases. They show human beings refusing the clean drama that later legends prefer. They do not vanish on cue. They negotiate. They shrink their expectations. They salvage. They remember. They live in partial ruins because partial ruins can still provide shade. They repair one cistern instead of 10. They farm one field instead of 20. They keep one gate open and let another fill with sand. A city in decline is full of choices like that, small acts of triage made under pressure. Yet such choices also reveal that a threshold has been crossed. Once a city begins choosing which parts of itself to abandon, its unity weakens. The outer wall may still exist, but it no longer defines living space. The old market may still be visible, but commerce has shifted. The sacred centre may still stand, but fewer pilgrims come. Sand in the abandoned quarters becomes ordinary. Children no longer know those rooms as houses. They know them as mounds, dangerous walls, places to find old objects, places where snakes or foxes may live. Memory becomes local and fragmentary. Scholars still debate how to interpret these transformations. A poorer material culture may signal decline, but it may also reflect different values or local self-sufficiency. Reused buildings may suggest desperation, but also flexibility. A smaller settlement may be more sustainable than the larger city that preceded it. The language of collapse can sometimes hide adaptation. No single explanation fully accounts for what people experienced, because people in the same city may have experienced different endings. For one, household departure was loss. For another, it was opportunity. For another, staying was devotion. for another simply necessity. The final inhabitants may have understood the old city in ways we cannot reconstruct. They may have known which ruler built a wall, which canal failed first where treasure was rumoured to lie, which tombs were dangerous, which old inscriptions no one could read. They may have told stories explaining the ruins around them, some accurate, some transformed by time. When writing disappeared, or administration moved elsewhere, oral memory carried what it could. But oral memory changes with need. It preserves meaning more often than chronology. A drought becomes a curse. A conquest becomes a betrayal. A wealthy trading age becomes a golden past. The old city becomes a lesson. Eventually, even the people who stayed may leave, or their settlement may become so small that later archaeology barely notices it. A few shepherds use the wells. Travellers camp in the lee of walls. Nomads know the ruins as a landmark. Pilgrims visit a shrine built from older stone. In this stage, the city is no longer urban, but it is not entirely outside human life. It remains useful in fragments. The desert rarely receives a city all at once. It receives pieces over time as human uses become thinner and thinner, and with each thinning sand gains authority. A room no longer roofed becomes a hollow. A hollow catches dust. A street no longer crossed becomes a drift. A drift becomes a dunlet. A canal no longer cleared becomes a trench of sediment. The last people may not witness complete burial. They may leave while towers still stand high, while courtyards are only half filled, while old walls still make recognizable shadows. The image of a fully buried city belongs more to later centuries. The ending lived by its inhabitants was probably less complete and more uncertain. That uncertainty is perhaps the most human part of all. Few people know they're living through the final chapter of a place. They know only that things are harder than before. The well is poorer. The road is quieter. The tax is heavier. The young are leaving. The old stories feel larger. A wall has fallen and no one has repaired it. Life continues, but the future has narrowed. Then one day a household departs and does not return. Another follows. A shrine loses its caretaker. A field goes dry. The city does not announce its own ending, it simply has fewer witnesses. To focus only on buried buildings is to miss the living movement around them. Ancient cities buried in sand were not just monuments overcome by nature. They were communities that changed form under pressure. Their people adapted until adaptation no longer held them there. They stayed, reused, remembered, migrated and carried pieces of the old world into new settings. The ruins mark absence, but they also point toward continuance elsewhere. Sand covers the walls. It does not necessarily cover the descendants, the stories or the habits that travelled beyond them. In this way, the buried city becomes less like a grave and more like a shoreline after the tide has withdrawn. What remains on the sand is not the whole sea, only the trace of where it once reached. The people were the movement. The buildings were the edge it left behind. The real reason ancient cities were buried in sand is not a single reason at all, and that is precisely what makes the story worth following. Sand is the image that survives because sand is visible. It gathers against walls, fills rooms, hides roads, and turns streets into soft ridges under the sun. But sand is usually the last chapter written across the surface of a city whose deeper story has already begun to fail. By the time dunes enter the market, by the time canals choke, and courtyards fill the city has often lost something more important than open doorways. It has lost the balance that allowed it to exist. That balance was always complicated. Water had to arrive or be captured or be stored or be lifted from below. Fields had to produce without exhausting the soil. Animals had to graze without stripping the land bare. Trade had to continue along roads dangerous enough to make stopping places valuable. Rulers had to protect routes without crushing them under taxes. Workers had to maintain canals, cisterns, wells, walls, terraces, and roads year after year. Families had to believe the future was worth the labour. A desert city was never a simple settlement in a harsh place. It was a living agreement between environment, economy, power, and memory. When one part weakened, the city could often adjust. A dry year could be endured. A damaged canal could be repaired. A trade route could bend and still return. A ruler could be replaced. A district could shrink while another survived. Ancient communities were not fragile in the childish sense. Many were extraordinarily resilient. The ruins themselves prove this. They show centuries of adaptation, engineering, rebuilding, and patience. But resilience is not invincibility. When several pressures arrived together, the agreement became harder to keep. Climate might reduce the reliability of water. Irrigation might bring salts upward through the soil. Grazing and fuel cutting might loosen vegetation. Political instability might interrupt maintenance. War might scatter labour. Trade might shift toward another corridor. Taxation might force farmers to overwork already tired land. A river might change course. A spring might weaken. An earthquake might damage waterworks at the worst possible moment. Each cause alone could be survivable. Together they formed a net tightening around the city. This is why the question should not be framed as nature against humans. The desert did not simply attack civilization from outside. Human societies helped shape the landscapes that later became difficult for them. They intensified water use, expanded fields, concentrated animals, built walls that trapped sediment, depended on routes beyond their control, and created political systems that could either protect or exploit fragile environments. At the same time, they operated within natural systems far larger than themselves: monsoons, aquifers, rivers, wind, soil, chemistry, mountain snow, and long cycles of aridity. The buried city lies at the meeting point of both forces. It is neither purely natural disaster nor purely human mistake. It is entanglement made visible. No single explanation fully accounts for this because every city had its own pattern. Petra's story is not Merv's story. The oasis towns of the Tarim Basin are not the same as Saharan settlements, Arabian forts, Egyptian desert villages, or North African trade centres. Some declined mainly when trade routes shifted. Some suffered from watercourse changes. Some were devastated by conquest. Some shrank under environmental stress. Some never vanished completely, but transformed into smaller communities. The sand makes them look similar after the fact, but their histories were different. Archaeology's task is to restore those differences, yet beneath the differences lies a shared lesson: cities survive by maintenance. This sounds plain, almost too practical for ruins that inspire legends, but it is one of the deepest truths in the story. A city is not built once. It is rebuilt every day. Streets are kept open. Wells are watched. Reservoirs are cleaned. Roofs are repaired. Fields are planted. Disputes are settled. Roads are guarded. Taxes are negotiated. Children are taught where water comes from and which paths are safe. The visible city rests on repeated acts that rarely become famous. When these acts stop, even the strongest walls become temporary. Sand exposes the importance of maintenance because it takes over whenever maintenance pauses. It does not need hatred. It does not need intention. It is not punishing anyone. It simply follows wind, gravity, dryness, and opportunity. An uncleared threshold becomes a drift. An unused canal becomes a trough. An empty room becomes a trap. A broken wall becomes shelter for more sediment. The city's abandonment and burial are not separate events. They feed each other. As people leave, sand enters. As sand enters, return becomes harder. The most haunting part is that the process can be gradual enough to feel normal. One neighborhood closes. One road becomes less used. One well tastes worse. One field is left fallow. One tax official fails to arrive. One caravan chooses another route. Nothing by itself is the end. But history often turns on accumulations that do not announce themselves. By the time the city is obviously dying, many of the decisions that shaped its fate have already been made. This is also why the popular image of a city swallowed overnight is less frightening than the truth. A sudden disaster belongs to the realm of exception. Slow systemic failure belongs to the ordinary world. It is made from maintenance, delayed limits, ignored stresses compounded, and institutions unable to respond quickly enough. Ancient buried cities remind us that collapse is often not a cliff, but a slope. People live on that slope. They argue, adapt, hope, and work until the angle becomes too steep, and still these cities should not be remembered only for their endings. Their rise was astonishing. They made roads through emptiness. They stored storms in stone. They turned oases into gardens, way stations into markets, frontier settlements, into cosmopolitan centers. They connected worlds that might otherwise have remained distant. They show that humans are capable of remarkable invention under pressure. Their burial does not cancel that achievement. It completes the evidence of how difficult the achievement was. So the real reason is a chain. Water made the city possible. Trade made it important. Governance made it organized. Land use made it productive. Maintenance made it durable. Climate politics, economics, and environmental strain tested every link. When enough links weakened, the city could no longer resist the ordinary movement of sand. The dunes did not create the failure alone. They recorded it. They covered the last visible signs of a system that had already come apart beneath the surface. To stand before such a ruin is to see both confidence and vulnerability in the same frame. The walls say people believed they could stay. The sand says staying required more than belief. It required a balance that had to be renewed again and again. Once that renewal stopped, the desert did what it had always done. It moved. What sand remembers is not only loss, it remembers weight, movement, pressure, and pause. It remembers where walls stood against the wind, where a doorway opened into a room, where a canal cut through fields, where feet crossed the same street so often that the ground hardened under ordinary life. Sand records absence, but it also records shape. It gathers around what people leave behind, and in doing so preserves the outline of their effort. A buried city is therefore not only a warning from the past. It is a memory system made of grains, ruins, and time. The warning, however, is real. Ancient desert cities show how much civilization depends on balances that can feel permanent while they hold. Water appears in the well, so people trust the well. Roads bring caravans, so people trust the road. Fields produce grain, so people trust the field. Rulers collect taxes and repair walls, so people trust the order around them. But each of these things is conditional. A well depends on groundwater, rainfall maintenance, and fair access. A road depends on security demand animals and knowledge. A field depends on soil, drainage, labor, and climate. Order depends on legitimacy and capacity. When the conditions change, the familiar world begins to reveal its hidden fragility. This does not make ancient people naive. In many ways, they understood fragility more intimately than modern observers do. They watched skies, wells, animals, and harvests with attention sharpened by necessity. They stored grain, built cisterns, protected routes, and created laws around scarce resources. Their cities were not careless monuments built against nature. They were careful negotiations with nature. But even careful systems can be overwhelmed when pressures converge. What survives in the record suggests that many buried cities fell, not because they lacked intelligence, But because intelligence is not the same as control, the desert is especially honest about this. It strips away the illusion that human structures stand apart from landscape. In a humid forest, ruins may vanish under roots and leaves. In a modern city, old neighborhoods may disappear beneath concrete and glass. In the desert, the relationship is stark. Whirlwind, water, dust, heat, shadow, and abandonment remain visibly connected. The buried city seems to say that human ambition is powerful, but never outside the earth that carries it. There is a modern echo here, though it should be handled carefully. Ancient desert cities are not simple parables for the present, and it would be too easy to force them into a single lesson about climate overuse or collapse. Their worlds were different. Their technologies, populations, economies, and beliefs were different. Yet the pattern of dependence is familiar. Cities still rely on water systems, trade networks, energy flows, political stability and maintenance so routine that it becomes invisible. They still grow vulnerable when they treat those systems as guaranteed. The ruins do not predict one future, but they widen the imagination. They show that permanence is often a feeling, not a fact. The most unsettling thing about buried cities is that their people were not living in the past to themselves. They were living in the present. Their streets were current. Their worries were immediate. Their buildings did not look ancient. Their children did not think of themselves as part of a vanished civilization. They thought of waterwork, debt, worship, trade, kinship, sickness, weather, and the next season. That is why their ruins matter. They remind us that history is not made only by kings and catastrophes. It is made by ordinary continuities that seem too practical to be dramatic until they break. Sand remembers those continuities. It remembers the threshold swept clean for years before one final season when no one swept it. It remembers the canal that carried water before it carried dust. It remembers the courtyard where grain was stored. Meals were cooked and shade moved slowly across the floor. It remembers the road before the road became a line too faint to follow. It remembers the city not as a legend but as a working place where survival required effort. And perhaps that is the final truth beneath the dunes. Ancient cities were buried in sand because sand was waiting, but waiting alone was not enough. The cities first had to lose the systems that kept it outside water management, trade, governance, labor, confidence, and human presence. The desert did not erase them in a moment. It inherited them after their balances failed. It covered them, protected them, distorted them, and returned them centuries later as questions. When archaeologists brush sand from a wall, they are not simply uncovering stone. They are uncovering a relationship that once worked. For a time, people and landscape held together. Water moved, markets opened, fields ripened, lamps burned behind walls. Then slowly or violently the relationship changed. The city became less able to answer the demands of its place. The sand entered not as an enemy with a plan, but as the oldest resident of the landscape reclaiming space. So the buried city remains suspended between achievement and warning. It tells of human brilliance because only brilliant societies could have built so much in such difficult places. It tells of vulnerability because brilliance still needed maintenance, luck, and balance. It tells of disappearance but also of preservation. Under the dunes, the city is not entirely gone. It waits in fragments, holding the shape of streets, rooms, wells, and choices. The sand remembers what people forgot, and when the wind shifts, when a stone corner appears again in the light, the old question returns with it. Not simply why the city vanished, but how it endured for so long before the desert finally grew quiet over its name. Long after the last doorway disappears, the desert remains awake. Wind moves over the old city without hurry. It passes across buried rooms, broken canals, roofless houses, and stones that once held the warmth of human hands. Nothing in that movement is cruel. Nothing is merciful either. The desert does not remember as people remember. It does not keep names, victories, dynasties, or prayers in order. It keeps shapes. It keeps pressure. It keeps the outline of what resisted it, and the silence of what could resist no longer. Somewhere beneath the sand, a street still runs from one vanished quarter to another. A well still marks the place where people gathered before dawn. A courtyard still holds the dust of meals, work waiting, and ordinary conversation. The city is gone from life, but not from the earth. It has become slower than history, quieter than legend, and perhaps more honest than either. It no longer claims permanence. It simply remains. That is the final lesson of ancient cities buried in sand. They were not foolish dreams built in empty places. They were acts of confident skill, patience, and need. They rose because water could be found, because roads could be crossed, because people could organize labor and hope around fragile gifts. They fell because those gifts changed, and because no city, however clever, lives outside the conditions that sustain it. In the end, the sand does not only cover failure, it covers endurance. It covers centuries of repair, harvest, travel, worship, trade, fear, and adaptation. It covers lives that were not thinking about becoming mysterious. They were simply trying to continue, and then continuation became impossible. The wind keeps moving. The dunes shift by inches. A carved stone waits under the surface. A wall corner catches the light for the first time in hundreds of years. For a moment the buried city returns, not as it was not fully, but enough to remind the living that every civilization is a conversation with its landscape, and every conversation depends on listening before the silence begins.